8. An earthquake in progress. As history would see it, 1956 would be year one, ground zero, in the phenomenon known as Elvis Presley. So much metamorphosis would occur in both his personal and professional lives that 1956 could be seen as a reference point, a time when Elvis would go from being a regional performer to a national sensation, ending his age of innocence. By the end of the year, the shedding of his old skin would be both powerful and complete, and Elvis would be almost unrecognizable as the shy, unassuming boy that fame could never change. On January 8th, he celebrated his 21st birthday, flying home to Memphis from a hayride appearance in Shreveport, and then insuring his 1955 pink and black Cadillac Fleetwood. He was taking care of business and being responsible. No one could have known it, but he was precisely through the first half of his short life, destined to die at 42. Though he was now officially a man, a grown-up, he would never reach an adult's maturity in his relationships with women. His fun-loving pranks of handcuffing and wrestling would evolve into more acceptable forms of physical teasing, and he would begin to have more complex relationships. But he would remain the puer aeternus, a Latin term for eternal boy, seen in mythology as a child god of divine youth, an Adonis who stays forever young. In pop psychology, the puer is seen as being a socially immature adult and suffers from what has entered the lexicon as the Peter Pan syndrome. The reference is to J.M. Barrie's much-loved novel and play, as well as to Dan Kiley's 1983 book, The Peter Pan Syndrome, Men Who Have Never Grown Up. But in analytical or Jungian psychology, the puer is defined as an older man whose emotional life remains arrested at the level of adolescence, and who is almost always enmeshed in too great a dependence on his mother. The life of the puer is provisional, since he fears being caught in a situation from which he cannot escape, whether it is with a woman or a job. He fantasizes that he is simply marking time, and that in the future the real woman, or the right career opportunity, will come along. What he dreads most is to be bound to anything at all, and so he refuses to grow up and face the challenges of life head-on. Instead, he waits for others or divine providence to do it for him. He covets independence and freedom, chafes at boundaries and limits, and tends to find any restriction intolerable, writes Darrell Sharp in Jung Lexicon, a primer of terms and concepts. Common symptoms of puer psychology are dreams of imprisonment and similar imagery, chains, bars, cages, entrapment, bondage. Life itself is experienced as a prison. On January 10, 1956, Elvis arrived at the RCA recording studio in Nashville, a small building at 1525 McGavick Street, not far from downtown. The label had not yet established its own Nashville facilities, and so the company built the studio with the Methodist TV, Radio, and Film Commission. Chet Atkins, the country guitarist who was also RCA's Nashville studio chief, sat behind the console as Elvis recorded his first RCA sides. Yet some of the players were already familiar to Elvis. Both drummer DJ Fontana and piano virtuoso Floyd Kramer from the Hayride were on the sessions, and among the 3 songs they cut that day was Heartbeat Hotel, the morbid and oddly unsettling blues tune that Mae Axton had written with her friend Tommy Durden about a dwelling place for the lost and lovelorn. By April, the single, both eerie and menacing, would sell 1 million copies, earning Elvis his first gold record. The song found its genesis when Durden, who followed the Ponies, picked up a copy of the Miami Herald. He looked at the horse race entries and then scanned the rest of the paper. I just happened to catch a little small thing in there about a man who killed himself. I don't recall any names, but the only thing he left in the way of a suicide note was a sentence. I walk a lonely street. Atkins recalled that on one of the livelier songs they recorded that day, either Ray Charles's rhythm and blues classic, I Got a Woman, or the Drifters' Money Honey, Elvis started jumping around, and he split his pants right in the seat. I'll never forget them. They were pink with black piping on the sides. He asked somebody to go back to the motel and get him another pair, and he left his old ones lying around someplace. The next day, this girl who worked for the Methodists found them. She said, "What am I supposed to do with these?" I said, "Keep 'em. They'll be worth a lot of money one day." She thought that was very funny, but 6 months later I heard she was trying to get on I've Got a Secret. Her secret was going to be that she got Elvis Presley's pants. Elvis was all over the television that year, beginning on January 28th when he made his first of 6 appearances on Stage Show, a variety hour produced by Jackie Gleason and hosted by big band legends Jimmy and Tommy Dorsey. He flew into New York a few days earlier with the Colonel to meet the top brass at RCA, including Ann Fulcino, the Boston-bred national publicity director who had upgraded RCA's pop and country coverage, but also hoped the label would break a big new pop artist. Elvis had been to New York once before, in 1955, when he and Scotty and Bill auditioned for Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts, where a woman, possibly Godfrey vocalist Jeanette Davis, who hailed from Memphis and became a full member of the production staff in 1956, turned them down. But it was still all so new to Elvis, meeting all these people who didn't talk like he did and who didn't seem to share his sense of humor. He didn't really know how to act. When Fulcino extended her hand, she was horrified to find that Elvis grasped it wearing an electric buzzer on his finger. My attitude was to make a total star out of Elvis, not a kid with a one-hit record, but a broad, overall star. So I said to him, that may be big in Nashville, but it will never go down in New York. Don't ever do it again. Now, he was a smart kid, and if you caught him doing something that was dumb for the occasion, he absorbed it and he didn't repeat it. For example, I took him to Klub's, a German restaurant on 23rd Street, just a block across the street from where the RCA office was at that time. I ordered pork chops, and he started to pick his up with his hands. Then suddenly he noticed that I was eating mine with a fork, and he paid attention to where the forks were and what I did with them. This is where I give him great credit. He wanted to get somewhere, and he knew he had to do certain things to get there. He was very intelligent. Not the Harvard-type intelligence, the instinctive intelligence. But it was still a lot to deal with in a short span of time. A few days later, Fulcino and RCA hosted a press reception for Elvis, and reporters, amused by the flash in the pan with the funny clothes and the suggestive stage moves, asked about his reaction to his success. "It scares me," Elvis said. It just scares me." By spring, his anxiety about fame seemed just as strong. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, British reporter Lionel Crane of the London Daily Mirror asked about the audience reception, a scream that I thought would split the roof, as Crane put it. "It makes me want to cry," Elvis said. "How does all this happen to me?" 5 days later, it was the same in Waco, Texas. His fame happened so fast, Elvis told a local reporter. "I could go out like a light just like I came on." By then, the press was calling him the most talked-about new personality in the last 10 years of recorded music. It was all snowballing now. The Colonel, putting pressure on Harry Kalheim at the William Morris Agency in New York, got him booked on The Milton Berle Show for April, and after a Hollywood screen test at Paramount Studios in late March, producer Hal Wallace signed him to a contract for 1 motion picture with an option for 6 more, the money starting at $15,000 for the first film, up to $100,000 for the 7th. Elvis's acting experience, however, consisted almost entirely of the Christmas pageants in the Assembly of God Church in Tupelo as a child. He was understandably nervous, then, for his tryout, especially as he was given the material. 2 dramatic scenes from The Rainmaker, which Wallace was about to begin filming with Burt Lancaster and Katharine Hepburn, only the night before. For a musical number, he lip-synced his new single, a cover of Carl Perkins's Blue Suede Shoes, while strumming a prop guitar. The results of the screen test surprised nearly everyone. Steve Scholes, head of RCA's country and R&B divisions, and Chick Crumpacker of the label's promotion staff, viewed the test in New York along with other Victor people, and Crumpacker recalls they could barely believe what they saw. Elvis suggested he had the power to legitimately follow Marlon Brando or his hero, James Dean. We went back to the office, and it was the talk of the place, like, my God, this guy has all of that natural quality that these other actors have become famous for, because he has that same directness and ability to be himself on the screen. It looked like he wasn't acting at all. We were stunned. Screenwriter Alan Weiss, who would later write 5 Presley pictures, also saw it. In his view, Elvis seemed amateurish in the dramatic scenes, looking like the lead in a high school play. But once the music was added, the transformation was incredible. Electricity bounced off the walls of the soundstage. It was like an earthquake in progress, only without the implicit threat. Elvis was too in demand to have to give up the majority of his Saturday nights for the hayride now. So the Colonel sent Horace Logan a cashier's check for $10,000 to buy out his contract, with a promise to appear on a special hayride charity show in December. Logan was getting a bargain, the Colonel told him. By then, Elvis would be so big they'd have to hold that show someplace other than KWKH. The girls would tear the place down. The swirl of it all appears to be a dream to me, Elvis told reporters in Lexington, Kentucky. He was sounding more optimistic now, in part because he had a new ally. Joe Hazen, Hal Wallace's business partner, was excited about Elvis's potential as an actor. He sent a memo to Wallace saying Elvis's meteoric rise is unquestionably a freak situation, but that still does not detract from the fact that as a straight actor, the guy has great potentialities. Elvis, who hoped he wouldn't have to sing in his movies, was beside himself with joy. The former movie theater usher told Wallace, "My ambition has always been to become a motion picture actor. A good one, sir." In March, Elvis, buoyed by a future in films and the Colonel's promise of turning $1 million worth of talent into $1 million, paid $40,000 for a single-story, ranch-style house for himself and his parents at 1034 Audubon Drive, located in a fashionable, upscale neighborhood of doctors and lawyers east of downtown Memphis near Memphis State University. A typical American dream home with pastel green board and batten siding, slate gray tiled roof, red brick trim, and black shutters framing white windows. It was the first house the Presleys had owned since leaving Tupelo. Elvis was proud that he could provide it, and he particularly liked the double carport. He and Vernon were constantly jockeying automobiles in the driveway. The home had 3 bedrooms, and Elvis used one for his huge collection of stuffed animals, many of them gifts from fans. For his primary bedroom, Gladys chose a remarkably girlish motif, decorating twin beds with pink taffeta dust ruffles and white quilted bedspreads with pink and blue flowers. From there, she hung pale yellow wallpaper flecked with blue and orange, white ceramic figures caught in mid-leap on black oval plaques dotted the walls, and installed a dark pink telephone that matched a selection of his pink stuffed animals. In truth, his room looked like something his fans would have wanted themselves, but Elvis seemed not to mind. That spring, he began seeing Barbara Hearn, a friend of Dixie Locke he had known casually for several years. A dark-haired beauty who bore more than a passing resemblance to Elizabeth Taylor. Barbara exuded sophistication and intelligence. Soon, she would be first runner-up in the Miss Memphis contest, the other contestants voting her Miss Personality for her charm and wit. But Barbara also had a quiet, serious side. Like Elvis, she was an only child and found herself in the same role reversal that Elvis had with his mother, in that sometimes she was the parent. Her mother and father divorced when she was still quite young, and she lived with her grandparents until she was 12. My mom was sort of a party animal, and I worried about her a lot, because I would mostly get in before she did. She had seen Elvis perform once at the Old Fellows Hall. A friend had called and asked if she wanted to go see the new hillbilly singer. Barbara asked his name. Elvis, her friend replied. Barbara said, "What's an Elvis?" The next time she saw him, he was dating Dixie, with whom she went to school at Southside High. At Christmas, 1954, they'd both gotten jobs at Goldsmith's department store. Dixie assigned to the basement and Barbara to the main floor bakery, which proved to be a bit beyond her. The first person who came up wanted a loaf of French bread, and she said she wanted it sliced. So I put the French loaf in the slicer, and I was supposed to pull the lever and then put the bread in and push the button. But I didn't, and I pulled the handle, and it shot that loaf of French bread all the way across Goldsmith's main floor. Quickly, I found myself in the basement with Dixie, in the seconds, in men's underwear and socks. Barbara and Dixie rode the bus to work, but one day Dixie said her boyfriend was coming to pick her up. She'd see if he would give Barbara a ride, too, since she didn't live far out of the way. When the big Lincoln pulled up, it was so huge we could have gotten everybody who worked in the basement in there. Barbara was surprised to see it was Elvis. From then on, Elvis gave Barbara a ride home many times, and often she would go with Dixie to visit his parents on Alabama Street. Elvis was already appearing on the Louisiana Hayride and doing road shows, so Barbara got to know his family before she really knew him. She liked them all, including Elvis's grandmother. She was a great old lady. Barbara even liked Vernon, who was more standoffish than Gladys, certainly not outward and friendly like she was. But once, when Barbara and Dixie were visiting, Vernon overrode his own frugality and went out and bought a bag of hamburgers for everyone. As far as Barbara was concerned, the Presleys may have had very little, but they were a nice, hospitable family, and she felt comfortable in their modest home. At the time, Barbara was dating Ronald Smith, the musician who had suggested that Elvis try out for the ill-fated job with Eddie Bond's band. But when she next saw Elvis in early 1956, much had happened. He and Dixie had broken up, and she and Ronald, too. She was now working as an advertising copywriter for a local jewelry store, Perel and Lowenstein. And since she was so photogenic, her boss sometimes asked the 19-year-old to do the store's live TV commercials, standing up and showing off their stuff, broadcast during the weather and the news. She was at the WMC TV one night on the job when Elvis dropped by the station to visit his friend George Klein, who worked in radio out of the same building. Elvis came to the window of the TV studio and poked his head in and watched what was going on. When I came out, the first thing he said was, "How's Dixie?" I said, "Well, I don't know. I haven't seen her since we got out of school." Barbara was moved that Elvis still cared enough about Dixie to ask. But Elvis interpreted her comment to mean that Barbara no longer had any special allegiance to Dixie, and that she was free to date whomever she pleased. She had a girlfriend waiting for her at the studio that night, and Elvis suggested the four of them go to the Variety Club. When they got there, they were surprised to find themselves the only people in the place. They had a Coke and sat and talked, and Barbara could tell he was interested in her. He said he was going on a tour, and he would call me from there. I said, okay, and gave him my telephone number. And sure enough, he did. Barbara would become Elvis's first publicly acknowledged girlfriend as he hit the national spotlight, and they would be much photographed together. Unlike most of the girls Elvis dated, Barbara wasn't mesmerized by his stage movements. She liked the way he kissed, and certainly theirs was a boy-meets-girl attraction, even though I wasn't carried away by his looks or anything. She didn't think he was strange, as so many did, because she was attracted to unusual people. But she found him surprisingly insecure. That's what all the hair primping and clothes were about, she thought, not vanity. But she also thought he was very personable and fun and funny, and he made her laugh. She never knew just what he was going to do. Often, Elvis would drive up alongside the bus that I was riding home. He would get the attention of the bus driver and have him stop so I could hop off and continue my journey home with him, sometimes on his motorcycle. Of course, all the other passengers were thrilled to see him. Their dates included many of the typical activities Elvis had shared with Dixie: going to the fairgrounds, taking in a movie, riding around and stopping for burgers and cokes, and driving over to Poplar Tunes and looking through records. They talked by the hour about music, listening to the radio and discussing the songs and the singers. They would often sit at the organ, and Elvis would play their favorite song, Katherine Grayson and Howard Keel's Make Believe, and tried to get Barbara to sing with him, teasing her because she couldn't carry a tune. When Elvis was away, Gladys would often call Barbara and ask her to come out to the house and visit with her, and Gladys sometimes sat at that same organ. She couldn't actually play, but she would touch the keys, and it seemed to produce the most mournful sounds. A lot of people say she was funny and witty, but I never saw that side. She was interesting and amusing at times, but after Colonel Parker and the Fame came into play, I think she was more sad than anything, wishing she could awaken and find life as it was before, knowing it would never be, and just not wanting to accept the definite change. Things seemed to be closing in around Gladys. The Audubon Drive neighbors wanted a word with her about everything. They didn't like it that she hung out her wash. This is not that kind of neighborhood. And they hated the fans who trampled through the grass and clogged the traffic on their quiet street. It all just made her nervous, like the trees she'd had cut down around the property in Tupelo. She started taking diet pills to help with her weight, and like so many in her family, she began to drink heavily, eating onions to disguise her breath. Her older sister Lillian had spoken to her about it, though Barbara never knew her to be the slightest bit intoxicated. She was always neat, clean, and meticulously dressed, even in a duster housecoat, and never appeared in hairpins or curlers. She carried herself as a woman who still felt she was the attractive girl she once was. However, deep down, Gladys was gripped with fear that someone would hurt Elvis. She was gracious to the girls who came to the front door and handed out face tissues so they could wipe the dust off of Elvis's cars and keep it. But she was obsessed that they would accidentally tear him apart in their love for him, or, after the Texas incident with the roughneck, that their jealous boyfriends would kill him. Young men, angry that their girls had made fools of themselves and charging the stage, were already saying rude things like they wanted a piece of his ass, or they wanted to knock the shit out of this pretty boy, change his face. It made Gladys tremble all over. When Elvis and Barbara went to the movies, I would telephone her a couple of times during the evening to let her know that we were all right, and that there was nobody threatening around. Gladys worried so much that she kept herself in a perpetual state of gloom, and her health began to fail. She was often run down, and her feet swelled from kidney trouble. Her eyes, dark shiners now, took on a frightened look. Overall, she was proud, anxious, and lost. Elvis thought maybe she needed a pet and got her a tiny lap dog named Sweet Pea, after the adopted son of Popeye, the cartoon sailor. But Gladys didn't really like animals all that much, and little seemed to cheer her. She was serious and concerned, says Barbara. She had to be. Goodness knows she was the captain of that little ship, with all the responsibility that entailed. Vernon, as usual, was virtually no help. He was still nearly a non-participant in the household, and besides, he was preoccupied with the idea of Elvis buying him a used car lot, Presley's Used Cars. He thought he could make a go of it, and it would get him out of the house. For the time being, he helped Barbara answer Elvis's fan mail, which arrived in big, bulging canvas sacks, even though most of it had been funneled to Kay Wheeler, the fan club president in Texas, or Colonel Parker's office in Madison. I wrote most of Elvis's fan letters, Barbara remembers, and Mr. Presley and I signed his name. As Dixie had before her, Barbara was becoming like one of the family now, and Gladys sometimes visited her mother, Pearl, a strong, determined, charming woman, at her home on Marjorie Street. For the longest time, Vernon parked on the street, and Gladys huffed and puffed up the long steps to the big Victorian house. Finally, one day, Barbara's aunt came out and said, "Mrs. Presley, why don't you just drive up to the back door? There are no steps back there." Just as Elvis had a way of making every girl feel as if she were the one, Barbara saw that Gladys did the same. I know she liked me and enjoyed my company. We would go for the proverbial Sunday afternoon drive when Elvis wasn't home, and we sat and talked together a lot. But I think she made all of the girls feel special. I understand why so many say that Mrs. Presley wanted Elvis to marry them. She wanted him to get married, and she wanted lots of grandchildren. And so Barbara wasn't surprised when Elvis gave her a ring, even though she had mixed emotions about it. They were at Jim's Steakhouse in Memphis, having dinner with some other people, when suddenly he just reached in his pocket and put this little ring box in front of me. My first thought was, oh no, he's going to ruin everything, because I truly thought for a second that it was an engagement ring, and getting married at 19 was way down on my list. When I saw that it was a black onyx with a couple of diamonds around it, I was so happy. I did not want to get married. I wanted him to care for me, and I cared for him a great deal, but I would have been happy to have gone on as we were, practically forever. In retrospect, she and Elvis weren't a great match because they both came from a family of worriers. I could give lessons, really, in worrying. While Gladys perseverated about one thing, Vernon stewed about another, usually money. We were having a meal at their house, and Mr. Presley was going through the bills. He picked one up and looked at it, and he said, $126, and then he named a jewelry store. He said, "What in the world is this for, son?" And Elvis said, "Oh, Daddy, don't spoil everything for me." It was my ring, $126. Barbara saw the humor in such a situation, but she was far more troubled by Elvis's jealous streak. One night, they went up to talk to Dewey Phillips, and they came out of the radio station to find a large crowd had gathered for Elvis. He stopped to talk to people, and Barbara stepped back out of the way. In a moment or two, a young man came up and started making conversation with her. Elvis broke away from that crowd, came over, got me by the arm, and marched me like a naughty child down to his car. I thought, what in the world is happening here? I said, "What's the matter? Are you angry with me?" And he said, "I don't want you standing around talking to men on the sidewalk." He went on and on and on, and I was just flabbergasted. The irony, of course, was that Elvis felt free to do whatever he wanted with other women. My husband tells everybody that Elvis and I dated steadily for a year. And I say, no, I dated him steadily for a year. He didn't date anybody steadily for more than 15 minutes. Their relationship was thoroughly chaste. Lots of hugging, kissing, and closeness. Perhaps activity a lot of girls would have killed to participate in. But nothing sexually explicit. Reputation was a big deal around my house. Barbara never asked him about it, but she suspected that he divided women into good girls and road girls, the latter of whom were fair game and didn't mean anything to him beyond the moment. He was very, very respectful to women. If you could see how he treated me, my mother, his own mom, his grandmother, we were people he cared about. The ones who went backstage were in a different category. They were fans. On April 15th, 1956, Elvis, billed as the nation's only atomic-powered singer, played the Municipal Auditorium in San Antonio, Texas. There to meet him was Kay Wheeler, the virginal 17-year-old president of the first national Elvis Presley fan club. Kay was in something of a teenage daze. A year earlier, she hadn't even been able to find a picture of Elvis. But by early 1956, working from her Dallas home and aided by her two sisters, she had built the club into more than 20,000 members, each of whom received a large autographed photo of Elvis, a Presley pink membership card, and a 4-page monthly newsletter, the Presley Press. Though the Colonel's office had encouraged her efforts, Kay was as atomic-powered as the object of her affections, and only Colonel Parker matched her devotion and energy in promoting Elvis into a major heartthrob. Campaigning radio stations to play his records, and instructing the flock to do the same, she hardly had any time for homework, let alone her boyfriend, Pat. At the beginning of the month, Kay had received a letter from Parker's secretary, Carolyn Asmus, telling her that Elvis would be on tour in Texas and inviting her to attend the kickoff show in San Antonio. Shortly thereafter, she received a telegram from the Colonel himself, authorizing her to go backstage. When the big day came, she chose a clinging pale beige sheath dress, dangly pearl earrings, and a pair of spike heels. Then she boarded the Greyhound bus for a 270-mile ride that would mark her first trip away from home. Hell and high water wouldn't have stopped me. I looked out that Greyhound window thinking, oh my God, I'm going to see Elvis. When she arrived at the auditorium, an old, dirty structure that seemed too unglamorous for what was about to unfold, she flashed her telegram to a guard who waved her through. Backstage, Tom Diskin, the Colonel's second-in-command, pointed to an unmarked door and nonchalantly said, Elvis is in his dressing room. Just go on in. Kay took a deep breath, straightened her dress, and turned the tarnished doorknob. She hoped he would like her. She thought he might, because even she could see she looked a little bit like his mother. He was sitting in front of a mirror, smoothing down his dark blonde ducktail, and turned to look over his shoulder at her. Her knees went wobbly. Hi, Elvis, she managed. I'm Kay Wheeler, the president of your fan club. My fan club president? He asked. He seemed surprised. Kay thought he knew she was coming, but there wasn't time to think about that now, because he had on a blue satin shirt that matched his eyes, and his voice was soft and sensuous, and he had a mischievous grin on his face, and he was looking straight at her. If any man ever stepped out of a dream, she thought, it was Elvis Presley. He stood up and walked toward her, staring, she thought, as if he were trying to read her mind. The room began swirling, but she could see he was still smiling, and she thought he was about to say something. Instead, he reached over and put his hands on her shoulders, and then began following her curves. He slid his hands up over her hips, then moved his fingers to her waist, and nearly up to her breasts. Finally, he spoke. Is all this really you? He pretty much groped me, she says, remembering. I didn't know what to think. My heart was beating 1,000 miles an hour. I was overwhelmed. He came on like Godzilla. She stepped back until his hands dropped away, and then they were both embarrassed. Well, he said, and then seemed at a loss for words. Gee, she murmured, but she loved this Memphis flash. I was on the same page with him. We were both young and riding the rock and roll wave. Just about then, the door opened, and in came a gaggle of reporters to ask him questions. Kay stood back and watched, thinking what a chameleon Elvis was, slipping casually out of one skin and into another, depending on the nature of the question asked or who was doing the asking. Then one reporter asked Elvis if he planned to marry. "Why buy a cow when you can milk it through the fence?" he said, a comment that would be picked up by the national press and spark outrage, even as it was toned down to, "Why buy a cow when you can get milk under the fence?" But he was so charming, breaking into a boyish laugh, that he won over whoever happened to be around. Kay had to admit that his appeal, while intoxicating, was complex. He was so pretty, so androgynous, and he seemed both angelic and thuggish at the same time. Later, she read what a fan told one of the reporters that night, that she liked him because he looked so mean. She knew what the girl meant. He was just so many emotions wrapped up in one big, gorgeous cover. Suddenly, Elvis saw Kay standing in the corner and motioned for her to come over. Then, before she knew what was happening, he grabbed her, turned her around, and pulled her toward him until her back was pressed up against him. He folded her into his arms and held her in a suggestive embrace, kissing the side of her face as photographers snapped away. Kay didn't know anything about a girlfriend named Barbara Hearn waiting for him in Memphis, nor did she know one of the pictures would wind up on the cover of a national magazine. She just couldn't believe what was happening. Now, she says, he should have been under freaking arrest. He's feeling me up in that one picture. Those are some of the most blatantly sensual poses that I've ever seen him in with a girl. He kissed her passionately just before he went on stage, pushing against her in a way no boy had ever done before. Then he launched into the first of 2 shows before 6,000 deafening fans, following, among other performers, Wanda Jackson, to whom Elvis had only recently given his man's diamond ring. Afterward, before the second show, he asked Kay if she would come to his performance in Fort Worth later that week. She said she would and asked him to sign some photos for the fans. Then he introduced her to Scotty, Bill, and DJ, and motioned for her to stand beside the backstage curtain so she could get an intimate view of the show. In her brief exchange with Scotty, the guitarist had asked if she planned her own career in show business. Kay laughed and said that she was no singer, but she could dance. And then, caught up in the moment, she announced that she'd be moving to their music in just a few minutes. Elvis had no idea that she was an accomplished dancer, and that listening to Hank Ballard and Sexy Ways, she'd improvised on the current dance steps, melding together the white from rock and the black from bop for a routine uniquely her own. She was so good at it, in fact, that within 2 years she would earn a starring role in a Hollywood B picture, Rock Baby Rocket, doing the dance she called the rock and bop. Now, during Elvis's performance of Money Honey, Kay began dancing her bop in the wings. She was lost in her own moment for a while, but then in the instrumental break she noticed Elvis, Scotty, Bill, and even DJ watching her. When Elvis came off stage, he had just one question for her. "Where did you learn how to do that?" Afterward, he kept her close, and while waiting for the crowd to thin, he couldn't get out of the auditorium for the throng of fans outside. He asked for the house organ in the auditorium to be turned on. Then he took off his coat, lit a small cigar, and in a poignant moment began playing Harbor Lights, singing just to Kay. Like most teenagers in the thrill of early love, she was transported, feeling a connection to him that seemed to come from some unearthly place. It was almost like we knew each other from somewhere else, you know? Perhaps there was destiny involved after all. Before Kay left that night, sleeping at her friend Tina's house, Elvis asked her more about her rock and bop. He asked me to show him the steps, and then Scotty picked up his guitar, and we did a little number together there, the 3 of us backstage. Up to that point, all he was doing was the hillbilly cat stuff, just shaking both his legs and vibrating, not really doing any footwork. I taught him a few of the bop steps that the black people were doing back then, and told him to go crazy with it. Later, she was surprised to see that he had worked it into his stage act. I don't know if he saw the bop somewhere else, but I do know that he incorporated some of the heel-toe moves after that, because I went back and looked at what he was doing before and after that time. Teaching him that, being able to give something back to the man who had given her so much enjoyment was a nice thing, a nice moment, she says. We were like crazy kids, just having a ball. It was one of the best days of her life. And, in retrospect, one of Elvis's. The boy who couldn't dance in high school had just picked up a signature stage move, one that would help define his early style. Somehow, the fact that he learned it from a teenage girl seemed fitting. Near the end of April, Elvis opened a 2-week run in the Venus Room at the New Frontier Hotel in Las Vegas. The Colonel had booked Eddie Arnold into Vegas on numerous occasions and considered it his playground. He counted many friends there, some of whom were heavy in the underworld. His connections, coupled with his growing love of gambling, made Vegas seem like a perfect showcase for his new client, especially as he commanded $7,500 a week for Elvis in advance and in cash. They got an atom bomb testing place out there in the desert, he explained. What if some feller pressed the wrong button? But Parker miscalculated. Elvis was still too immature and unpolished for Vegas. He introduced his first #1 hit as Heartburn Motel, and the New Frontier audience was not made up of hormonal teenagers, but an older, jaded crowd, most of whom had come to see band leader Freddie Martin, whose forte was pop arrangements of the classics. Elvis was scared stiff. Everything about the engagement was wrong. It was his first sit-down gig, and no matter what clothes he wore, even loafers and dress pants and a western-cut jacket, he seemed out of place. T.W. Richardson, the New Frontier's vice president and part owner, had heard about the singer in Richardson's hometown of Biloxi, and called the Colonel about the booking only a month before. The first night, Richardson invited a clutch of friends to gamble and take in the show, and among the guests was a Houston doctor, Tom Van Zant. According to Gabe Tucker, one of Parker's cronies, when Elvis took the stage, Dr. Van Zant jumped up from their ringside table and shouted, "God damn it, shit! What is all this yelling and screaming? I can't take this. Let's go to the tables and gamble." It was a rough debut, attended by only a smattering of applause, and Elvis was devastated. "After that first night," he said in 1959, "I went outside and just walked around in the dark. It was awful. I wasn't getting across to the audience." The Colonel quickly suggested that the hotel add a special matinee on Saturday for teenagers, where, for $1, they would see the performance and be served one soft drink. That afternoon, at a reserved table touching the stage, was Nancy Hebenstreit. The 13-year-old was in Las Vegas with her parents, Bruce and Anne, who were attending a golf event, the Tournament of Champions. During that time, Nancy would go to 7 or 8 of Elvis's shows. "He would sing directly to me," she recalled. He was very appreciative of having a bona fide fan. She had prayed he would be there. Just 11 days earlier, on April 12th, when he played the Armory with Farron Young and Wanda Jackson in her hometown of Albuquerque, New Mexico, Nancy waited outside the stage door after his second show with her friend Carla Singer, a classmate at St. Vincent Academy, a Catholic girls' school. The two stood there with a swarm of other girls about their age, and when Elvis came out to give autographs, Nancy prided herself on being the first one he kissed. The next day, the Albuquerque Tribune ran a front-page story about Elvis smooching St. Vincent girls, and Carla, who also got a kiss, was immediately expelled for bringing bad publicity to the school. It was a life-changing moment for both of them. In time, Nancy began imitating the singer, becoming perhaps the first female Elvis impersonator. If anyone did it earlier, they would have to prove it to me. She combed her hair into a modified ducktail, thickened her eyebrows and lips, added sideburns, and built up her shoulders, turning one of her father's jackets into Memphis cat clothes. Then, curling her lip, she strummed a cardboard guitar and lip-synced the words to Heartbreak Hotel. Known today as Nancy Kozakowski, an internationally acclaimed artist whose paintings, tapestry designs, and weavings can be found in museums, public buildings, and private collections, she was captivated as a child by the idea of what it would feel like to be Elvis on stage. The next year, she got kicked out of St. Vincent for edging on subversive, and at the talent show at her new school, Washington Junior High, the kids got so caught up in her performance that they forgot she was a girl. She was amazed at how electric the connection felt. Because I had seen him perform so closely, it was like I was him. The girls screamed. It sort of surprised me. Moreover, she was stunned at the power that even an imitation of Elvis could have over young kids. It was scary. It didn't occur to me that an imitation would even begin to do anything more than simply amuse people. But they went wild. However, Nancy had returned from Las Vegas with more than just the inspiration for her act. While checking into the Desert Inn, she saw a friend from Albuquerque, and since her pal had a brownie camera, Nancy suggested they go looking for Elvis. The New Frontier was right across the street, and they saw him immediately, leaving with Bill Black and Gene Smith. He posed for pictures with them, and Nancy reminded him of that earlier kiss, which earned her another. Elvis was happy to see such a youthful face. Vegas was where people went to get away from their kids. She ran into him on several occasions. He was always nice and flirty. And one morning, at the last Frontier Village Penny Arcade, he was all by himself, killing time. They hung out together, just having fun, popping quarters in the arcade booths. In one, they made a sound recording, a talking record. Hi, Hi, aren't you going to say my name or anything? Okay. Hi, Elvis. What are you doing here? And then they stuffed themselves into the 25-cent photo booth, taking pictures together and alone. Nancy's enraged boyfriend, the original Fonz, long hair, leather jacket, would later burn all but one, but the image that remained was a beauty, a black and white portrait of a hollow-jawed Elvis, a creature of the Vegas night, who looked as spooky as Dracula himself. By the time she left Las Vegas, Nancy had received a bouquet of Elvis kisses, more than a dozen in all. Very nice and sweet. He was not a lech. Besides, I was only 13 and thought he was too old for me. Elvis was in the lobby of the New Frontier one afternoon when he spotted Judy Spreckles, a comely young woman sitting at a small desk, engrossed in writing a letter. He approached her, struck up a conversation. How could you not know who he was even then? And after a smattering of small talk, Elvis took her to the gift shop to show her a magazine. He said, "This says I'm a hillbilly. I'm not, am I?" Judy looked at him and said, "No, you're a singer." After that, I was with him all the time. There wasn't a crowd then, just a few guys. She became the first sister he'd had since Betty Amos, and their friendship lasted until the day he died. Girls come and go, but sisters stay forever. He told me secrets that I never told and will never tell. At 23, Judy was the divorced sixth wife of sugar magnate Adolph Spreckles II. She had a ranch in Las Vegas, but was living at the hotel then, and she offered to be Elvis's secretary, an aide-de-camp. Soon, she would also come to Memphis, but both of them knew she was too worldly for him, and so they tamped down the obvious sexual spark. We were like kids, she said. In the afternoons, they'd ride the bumper cars at an amusement park and then go anywhere to escape the fans. He loved the fact that I had a light blue Cadillac, and he bought the same car for his mother in pink. One day, we drove my car out into the desert, and his cousin Jean came with us. Elvis drove that car as fast as it could go, and I was in the front seat whooping and screaming and laughing. His cousin was on the floor in the back, he was so scared. But I'd been a stunt player in the movies, and Elvis couldn't go fast enough to scare me. Now Elvis was learning to love Las Vegas, especially as he could take in a plethora of other shows. He particularly liked Freddie Bell and the Bellboys, whose novelty performance of Big Mama Thornton's rhythm and blues hit Hound Dog resonated with him down deep. He also loved meeting other entertainers, including those with whom he had something in common. Singer Johnny Ray, who was so emotive that he seemed to cry all the time, and piano legend Liberace, Gladys's favorite, who also had a twin who died at birth, and whose flamboyance with clothes and rings had long intrigued him. Soon Elvis would start reading a paperback book, The Loves of Liberace, picturing the closeted homosexual and a woman on the cover. However, Elvis was more interested in the showgirls. One night backstage, he met a bosomy blonde named Gloria Powell, who'd come with her friends, actor Rory Calhoun and his wife Lita Barron, to see comedian Shecky Green, who was also on the bill with Elvis and Freddie Martin. She was visiting with Green and another showgirl she'd worked with previously, her friends teasing her because her 1954 Los Angeles television show, which she'd developed around the character of Voluptua, had been canceled after 7 weeks, viewers citing it as too torrid. Elvis overheard the conversation and looked her up and down in her slinky black halter dress. He introduced himself. "Hi, ma'am, my name is Elvis." And then, with the same on-the-prowl look he once gave Betty Amos, he proceeded to take Gloria's right hand to his mouth and suck each of her fingers, rotating his tongue around them one by one. Gloria, who called herself a love goddess, had been around, but she was surprised a 21-year-old kid like Elvis would try such a thing. "Where did you learn to shake hands like that?" she asked him. "You don't provide towels by any chance, do you?" "I'm from Tennessee, ma'am," he said. "That's how we do things there. No, I don't provide towels because other girls don't try to wipe it off." "You're something else," she told him, though his brashness turned her off. "You're a corny, horny little hick." Gloria went back to the Calhouns at the table and told them what had happened. "I tell you," she said, "he's an original. I've never had that done to me before. He must have read it in a book somewhere." Finger-sucking was a sexually stimulating turn-on, she said. But not with that kid. At least one more pretty girl in Vegas was also immune to his charms. During his engagement, the Colonel took him over to visit his friend Milton Prell, the owner of the Sahara Hotel, known as the Jewel of the Desert, with its plaster camel standing guard at the entrance. Elvis immediately set his sights on 18-year-old Joan Adams, who had just won the title of Miss Nevada USA 1957. But more significantly, she was Miss Sahara, and her duties included traveling with the governor to woo convention business. Elvis made his way over to her, flirted, asked her name, and said he wanted to take her out. But unlike millions of women who swooned at the very sight of him, Joan didn't find him attractive and politely demurred. Elvis, his ego wounded, complained to Colonel Parker. "He went back like a sick little puppy and told everybody at the hotel that I turned him down. He said, 'Your Miss Sahara and Miss Nevada USA won't go out with me.' An hour later, Colonel Parker showed up with Milton Prell, along with Stan Irwin, the entertainment director, and Herb McDonald, the publicity director. But as Miss Sahara, Joan was off limits. They weren't allowed to ask me to go out with anyone, not even sit with somebody. But Colonel Parker said, "Why wouldn't you?" And I said, "He's a nice man, but he's just not my type." The colonel offered an insincere smile and narrowed his eyes. "Elvis is a gentleman. You don't have to worry about him." "I'm not worried about that," Joan replied, "and I'm very capable of taking care of myself." Herb McDonald then got on his hands and knees. "Please, Joan, please go out with Elvis for the publicity we'll get." Still, she refused, saying she didn't want to lead him on. Finally, Milton Prell, consort of gangsters and all manner of Vegas power, made his plea. "Joni, we've done everything you've asked. We haven't made you sit with anybody, or do anything you didn't want to do. Please go out with Elvis." At last, she relented, but only as a favor. Okay, all of you. Tell him to ask me again, and I'll do it." Elvis went back with his tail between his legs, and this time he talked about motorcycles. Someone told him Joan found them sexy, and he offered to rent one and take her for a ride. But even that fizzled. We had a flat tire and ended up in a Cadillac. They drove up to Sunrise Mountain. Elvis just wanted to see the lights of the city, he said. Joan had heard that one 100 times before, and when he put the car in park, she continued to sit in the corner, not wishing to give him the wrong impression. Elvis was running out of tactics now, and so he started singing to her. When she still didn't scoot over close, he said, "You obviously aren't a fan of my music." "I like to play the cello with my father," she replied, and exasperated, Elvis cut to the chase. He asked her where she lived, and she told him she had an 8-by-40-foot house trailer. He asked her to show it to him. No way, she told him. She wouldn't allow anybody in her trailer. More than that, she didn't let anybody get to know her because she was underage. I'd lied and said I was 21 because I was working at the Sahara. But Elvis wore her down, as he knew he would. Still, his evening didn't go as planned. He was sitting on my couch and kissing me, and then he started to do a little more than kissing. I told him no, 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 but he didn't take no for an answer. So I pushed him backward, and he fell off onto a square Formica table. Elvis hit the corner of it as he fell. Suddenly, he was lying on her floor, moaning, "I can't move." For a terrifying moment, she thought he'd broken his back. Joan panicked. I didn't know what to do. I thought, do I call Colonel Parker? Do I call the Sahara? What do I do? But he said, "Don't do anything. Just let me lie here." The next day, Elvis and the Colonel showed up at the Sahara with every record that Elvis ever made. The Colonel said they were from his private collection. Joan Adams would have a chance to add to that collection in another 13 years. By that time, she would be married to Alex Schufe, the man behind Elvis's far more successful Vegas engagements. In the next months, Elvis would begin to make national headlines, with both Time and Newsweek running stories on his phenomenal rise and other publications hurrying to follow suit. Elvis was now firmly in the national spotlight, but criticism over what some considered his lewd behavior began to mount. In May, after his performance in La Crosse, Wisconsin, the editor of the local newspaper notified FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover that Elvis's act included sexual self-gratification on stage. 10 days later, there was another riot, this one 20 minutes into Elvis's show in Kansas City, Missouri, where DJ's drums and Bill's bass were smashed, and DJ was thrown into the orchestra pit. Then, on June 5th, Elvis made his second appearance on the Milton Berle Show singing Hound Dog and making the most of the beat that DJ had picked up drumming in strip clubs. It was the performance that would come to define him both as a cultural threat and as an innovative, creative phenomenon. Most critics rushed to thrash him. Jack Gould of the New York Times writing, "Mr. Presley has no discernible singing ability," and Jack O'Brien of the New York Journal American deriding his display of primitive physical movement that is difficult to describe in terms suitable to a family newspaper. Interestingly, it was a woman, gossip columnist Hedda Hopper, who added the vitriol. I applaud parents of teenagers who work to get the blood and horror gangster shows off TV. They should work harder against the new alleged singer Elvis Presley. I caught him on Milton Berle's show and was revolted. Dressed like a zoot suiter, he acted as though he had St. Vitus dance and indulged in bumps and grinds that wouldn't be permitted in the lowest burlesque houses. 2 days later, a nervous Harry Kalkheim at William Morris suggested to the Colonel that perhaps Elvis should do less shaking. Also on the show that night was 22-year-old actress Deborah Paget, a contract player for 20th Century Fox. Elvis took note of her for 2 reasons. The petite, 5'2" redhead was just his physical type, going back to Carolyn Bradshaw, and she was talked about to play the female lead in his first motion picture, a Western tentatively titled The Reno Brothers, set to start filming in August. Producer Hal Wallace had loaned him out to the rival studio as a kind of test to see how audiences would respond to him. Even Wallace was concerned about Elvis's negative publicity, but he held fast to the memory of that fine screen test and decided he'd made the right choice in signing him. In defending his performance on the Berle show, Elvis told the Charlotte Observer that he hadn't been any sexier than Deborah Paget, who came out in a tight thing with feathers on the behind where they wiggle the most and who bumped and pooshed out all over the place. Already, she was on his mind. But he'd never forgotten about Dixie either, and at the end of May he'd stopped by her house as she returned from a dress rehearsal for her high school graduation. He told her he was seeing her friend Barbara Hearn now. Dixie was fine with it. She was moving on too. The next night, Elvis was in the seats at Ellis Auditorium to watch her graduate. He might have tried to resurrect the romance had it not been for an event that came out of the blue. On June 11th, 1956, he flew home off the road to attend the funeral of his cousin, Lee Edward Smith, who had drowned. As Elvis and his parents returned home from the service, he spotted a gal in the crowd surrounding the house. It was June Wanico, the Biloxi girl he'd met a year earlier. She was 18 now, and prettier than she'd been when he met her. Weeks after Elvis repeatedly tried calling her from the road, only to leave messages with her brother Jerry, June finally found out Elvis had made good on his promise. "Oh, by the way," Jerry said, "some guy with a hillbilly accent called you on the phone." By the time she called the operator back, it was too late. Elvis had long moved on from that number. She tried not to make a big deal out of it, despite her strong feelings, and purposely hadn't followed his career. In fact, when her friend Marie, a huge Elvis fan who attended a number of his shows, suggested that June join her and a group of girlfriends on a trip to Memphis, June said she'd rather go to Florida. But Marie had the car, so Memphis it was. When they arrived in town, they drove to Beale Street and stopped at Langsky Brothers, the store where Elvis bought his loud clothing. Marie wheedled his address out of Bernard Lansky, one of the owners, who added that he wasn't supposed to tell people where Elvis lived. But he guessed it wouldn't do any harm to just ride by because Elvis was out of town. Marie was upset. They'd come all this way and now Elvis wasn't home? But June was secretly relieved. She didn't know if he'd remember her. Now, at the house, she could see the construction from the Presley's new swimming pool in the backyard. They were all wondering what shape it was going to be in. Someone said she bet it was in the form of a guitar, when June said, "Well, let's go take a look." I got out of the car and they all followed me, trespassing. I was standing on the fence looking over when a big black Cadillac drove up in the driveway. Out stepped Elvis and his mother and father, all dressed in dark clothing. I don't know if he put 2 and 2 together, like Marie is from Biloxi, so that's June standing at the fence. But I turned and had my back to him, and he came up behind me and took me by the waist and picked me up off the ground and said, "What are you doing here?" She explained that she was there with the girls, and he said he'd been looking all over for her, that he'd called and left those messages for her to call back, and why hadn't she done it? They laughed about her nitwit brother, and then he said, "Somebody told me you were engaged to be married," and looked over at Marie. Well, never mind, Elvis said. He told her she had to stay the week, and his parents would be happy to have her. I think I probably was the first female guest on Audubon Drive. He would show her Memphis, and if his 1956 ivory Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz convertible were ready at the factory, they'd fly down to Houston and pick it up. He had all kinds of plans. They'd go motorcycle riding, they'd go to the movies, they'd see anything she wanted to see. He was so glad she was there, and he had so much to tell her. There were also so many unspoken thoughts in his head. Now that he was getting a little notoriety, he thought more about his lost twin. He wondered what Jessie would think about all this crazy stuff. But now he had June, at least for a week, and he was going to make the most of it. They wore matching motorcycle caps with bright white bills, and when they walked down the street, people stopped them and asked, "Are the two of you twins?" They just looked so much alike. Gladys, too, enjoyed June's company. They'd meet in the kitchen in the mornings while Elvis was still asleep and fix food together, sitting and drinking coffee as the sun came up. She saw me as domesticated and wise for my young years. Since my mother was divorced and working, I was the lady of the house. When I would get home from school, I would do the cooking, and I used to design and make all my clothes. The first time Mrs. Presley met me, she admired my skirt. I said, "Well, thanks, I made that." So she started taking it off of me, looking at the zipper. She said, "You sew really well. You could do this for a living." I said, "I don't know. I never did think about it like that." June could see that Gladys needed a confidant, that she had things on her mind. She was worried about this Colonel Parker, this cigar-smoking shyster. He made her nervous. But everything made her nervous of late, she said, even though June thought she seemed awfully calm and wondered about the pills she saw Gladys take from the windowsill in the kitchen. "I have a fear of waking up one day and all this just being a dream," she told her. She'd had nothing all her life, she said, and she just figured all this was too good to be true. It was happening too fast. Then the mood lifted and Gladys was saying, "You've got to pick a name for me other than Mrs. Presley because you're going to be a part of the family one day." June thought for a minute and decided on Lovey, an affectionate form of Gladys's middle name, Love. Gladys was wild about it, and about this girl. She thought I was a good catch for Elvis because I could do all these things, and I was from Mississippi, and I was crazy about her son. I was healthy-looking, too, so she thought I was perfect breeding stock, as we used to say. I was 5'6.5" about 128 pounds. She'd hug me and tell me I was pretty, and she would stroke my face. She was always telling me that Elvis needed someone to take care of him. And so Gladys didn't balk when Elvis said he was taking June to Houston with him to pick up his car, and that they would be gone overnight. Vernon drove them to the airport, where Elvis bought her ticket under the name of June Pritchard, choosing it to protect her identity, and also as a kind of joke. He'd tried to call her from Pritchard, Alabama, soon after they met. When they got to the hotel, they both signed in at the front desk, and he said, "Let's go see your room first, and then we'll go see mine." He opened the door to her room, and we hugged and kissed a little bit, and then we left. I don't think I even put my overnight bag down, because he said, "Take that with you, come on." She didn't know what to think or even what to do, and he saw it on her face. "June," he said, "I'm not going to hurt you. I respect you and love you. I want you to stay with me. I promise I will not touch you. I just want to hold you." And she says, "That's what happened. We slept like spoons in the bed the entire night." Then they flew back to Memphis. That's when she fell in love with him, on the way home. We'd spent so much time together, and I'd get lost in his eyes. He was just so very sincere. From then on, I knew I could trust him. 9. Love times 3. Elvis was scheduled to appear on The Steve Allen Show on July 1st, 1956. But 2 weeks before, the variety show host announced that the pressure to cancel the hip-wiggling sensation had been so strong that if Elvis did appear, he will not be allowed any of his offensive tactics. Allen, a savvy show business veteran, considered the controversy a piece of good luck, he said later. All the media hype and attention worked to our advantage, and Elvis was never really in danger of being canceled. The host, who was also a comedian, jazz musician, writer, actor, poet, and television pioneer, had tuned in stage show one night, where he saw this tall, gangly, kind of goofy-looking but cute offbeat kid. He only caught 2 minutes of him, but I could see he had something, and made a note to our people to book that kid. I didn't even know his name. Partly to capitalize on the outrage over Elvis's movements on the Milton Berle show, Allen scratched his head for a different way to spotlight him and also keep his movements contained. As he recalled nearly 40 years later, I personally came up with the 2 ideas that made Elvis look so good that night: the singing hound dog to an actual dog, and the Range Roundup sketch with Andy Griffith and Imogene Coca, the latter of which was a spoof on the Ozark Jubilee, the Grand Ole Opry, and Elvis's barn dance home, the Louisiana Hayride. Some of Elvis's fans were offended at the notion of their idol singing to a live basset hound, but Elvis took it all in stride, even agreeing to be fitted for a tuxedo. The twitchy basset would wear a top hat for the occasion. At the morning rehearsal on June 29th, Elvis became reacquainted with Al Wertheimer, a young photographer only slightly older than Elvis who had photographed him during his 5th stage show appearance. RCA's Anne Fulcino had hired the German émigré as part of her dedication to making Elvis a huge pop phenomenon. With no budget for publicity, or certainly nothing like the $200 or $300 a day Columbia Records paid freelance shutterbugs, she'd gone in search of talented, hungry kids who'd work cheap, striking a deal in which the photographers were free to shop their pictures and make a few bucks once she'd finished her campaign. That's the way she worked with Wertheimer. She picked him over a temperamental photographer she'd originally considered because Al, a quiet, laid-back, easygoing person, had the right personality to shadow the singer in close quarters and a variety of circumstances. I also knew he could handle the Colonel. She made the right choice. After late 1956, Parker lowered an iron curtain around Elvis, restricting media access to only a handful of carefully orchestrated events. Before that happened, Wertheimer, a night person like Elvis, would travel with him for a week, shooting some 3,800 frames, all unposed and in natural light, to chronicle both his professional and personal life. On stage, backstage, in the recording studio, at home with his parents and friends, and on the road with his fans. No other photographer would capture such startlingly intimate moments or chronicle such an important phase of Elvis's career. The resulting photos, elegant, eloquent, and iconic, were probably the first and the last look at the day-to-day life of Elvis Presley. Wertheimer has written, "I was a reporter whose pen was a camera." While RCA needed images that promoted Elvis as an explosive young singer on the rise, Wertheimer had another agenda. Basically, I was covering this story because Elvis made the girls cry, and I couldn't understand what he had that was that powerful, that brought all that raw emotion to the surface. As Fulcino predicted, Al was so unobtrusive and good at his job that many of the people who surrounded Elvis hardly knew he was there, and Elvis himself enjoyed being documented, allowing closeness that embarrassed even the photographer, particularly for an image Wertheimer calls The Kiss, a brief encounter between Elvis and a fan in the stairway of the Mosque Theater in Richmond, Virginia. According to Wertheimer, Diane Keaton, the actress and photographer, has called it the sexiest picture ever taken in the whole world. On the afternoon of June 29th, after the Steve Allen Show rehearsal, Elvis took the train to Richmond with the Colonel and an entourage that now included his cousins Bobby and Junior Smith, the latter of whom bore the haunted, eerie look of a crazed killer, having come home from Korea with a Section 8. The following day, Elvis was scheduled to perform 2 shows at the Mosque Theater at 5 and 8 p.m. His date for the day was a well-dressed young woman in a dark sleeveless dress and rhinestone earrings. A Southern girl, she had a fresh-faced look about her, with her dark blonde hair cut in a summer bob. Elvis apparently made her acquaintance in the Hotel Jefferson coffee shop, where only a few minutes earlier he'd wrapped his arm around the waitress. He had his script for the Steve Allen Show, and flipping through some of the pages, as Al remembered, he was trying to impress this young lady whose name I forgot to get, but she remained cool, not wanting to look too impressed. Elvis continued to try and loosen her up with conversation. At one point, he came in close, within 3 inches of her face, and just shouted, "Ah!" Al clicked off some shots, and then Junior said it was getting late and they needed to go to the theater for rehearsal. Elvis invited the blonde to come along, and a trusting soul, she climbed in the cab. On the ride to the theater, Elvis tried to amuse her, pointing out silly things like light fixtures and cracking jokes. He continued to be at turns debonair and playful, or stern, Al observed, wrapping both hands around her neck in a mock ceremony of choking her. While the other performers took turns on stage, Elvis flirted with her in another part of the theater, leading her into a dark, narrow alcove along the stairway, lit only by a window and a 50-watt light bulb. Al, walking from the men's lavatory, which doubled as the musicians' dressing room, was surprised to find the couple there and realized he'd stumbled on an intimate moment. Elvis, dressed in a dark suit and white buck shoes, propped his arm on the stair rail, slouching toward his date, who coyly leaned against the wall. She tipped the lower half of her body, inching toward him, her feet with his, so that the two of them made almost a V-shape standing so close together. Al was in a quandary. Do I leave them their privacy, or should I be a good reporter? If I shoot this, Elvis may have me fired. Then he took the chance, seeing they were so absorbed. He started shooting, keeping his distance at first, and then moved closer, closer, and closer still, until he was up on the railing of the stairway. He snapped a shot from above, looking down just as Elvis nuzzled the girl's cheek, his arms spread wide, one above her against the wall, the other anchoring him on the railing. It was so sensual, and their bodies so eager, that if the photo were rotated, it would seem as if the two were in bed. The photographer scarcely breathed. He asked to pass them. May I get by? But they were so focused they didn't even care. Al pivoted so that the window was behind him, illuminating his subjects with front-end sunlight and fill lighting from the dangling bulb. "Bet you can't kiss me, Elvis," the girl said, sticking out her tongue. "Betcha I can," he teased back, and then he made his move, sticking out his own tongue until the two were pressed together, tongues and noses, his waist pushing up against hers. By now, the girl was leaning back on the stair rail, and anything could happen. Al snapped the shutter, capturing the famous image, a distillation of the rock and roll roadshow and Elvis at his uninhibited best. The whole thing took 1/10 of a second, and then all Al heard was, "We want Elvis, we want Elvis." A minute later, Elvis sprinted on stage to give 4,000 people, mostly women and girls, the performance they had paid to see. Just who Elvis's date was that day remains a mystery. Since the image appears on commercial products, several women have approached Wertheimer through the years, each insisting she was the one. But whenever the photographer asks them questions about the day before or the day after, their stories never gel. I think Elvis kissed thousands of girls. He loved kissing girls. After his shows that night, Elvis climbed back on board a northbound train. Flying scared him, for his live appearance with Steve Allen the next evening. It was a Sunday. The show went as planned, Elvis wearing his prom night blue suede shoes with his tuxedo and performing I Want You, I Need You, I Love You, along with Hound Dog. He would record the latter song the next day at the RCA studios on New York's East 24th Street, along with Don't Be Cruel and Any Way You Want Me. Meticulous at getting what he wanted on tape, though, as in his Sundays, still arriving unprepared, Elvis took control of the recording session. "Try a little more space," he told Scotty at one point. After several takes of Don't Be Cruel, he squatted on the floor so his ears were at the same level as the huge speakers in the corner. No, he said, they would need to do it again. By the end of the day, he had insisted on 28 takes of Don't Be Cruel and 31 of Hound Dog. It was excessive, but no one was going to argue with him, because he was an idiot savant in the studio, knowing what would work, even if he couldn't always articulate it quickly. Beforehand, he'd spoken again to the press, saying that Barbara Hearn of Memphis and June Wanico of Biloxi, Mississippi, were the two girls he dated, Barbara being a good motorcycle date, he threw in. Meanwhile, outside the RCA building, fans held up signs saying, "We want the real Elvis," and "We want the gyratin' Elvis," not the restrained and sanitized one who appeared on the Steve Allen Show. But New Yorkers had seen two very different aspects of Elvis's personality in an exceedingly short time. At 11:30 that Sunday night, little more than 3 hours after the Allen Show signed on, Elvis appeared live on the WRCA TV interview program, Hi Gardner Calling. Gardner, a popular syndicated newspaper columnist, asked his guest the increasingly familiar questions about his critics, his music, and his effect on teenagers. Elvis, on camera at the Warwick Hotel, but holding a telephone to speak with Gardner, took it in good humor, answering a question about his 4 Cadillacs. I'm planning for 7. As well as a ridiculous rumor that he had once shot his mother. Well, I think that one takes the cake. That's about the funniest one I've ever heard. The show was memorable for 2 reasons. The shot of Elvis on the telephone exposed an ugly and prominent wart on his right wrist, which he would have removed in 1958. A Georgia fan named Joni Mabe would acquire it and keep it in a jar of formaldehyde, selling T-shirts proclaiming, "The king is gone, but the wart lives on." What got people talking, though, was Elvis's sleepy eyes and druggy speech. 2 weeks earlier, he had stopped by Wink Martindale's WHBQ-TV Top 10 Dance Party to promote his upcoming concert at Memphis's Russwood Stadium, a charity benefit for the Press Scimitar's Cynthia Milk Fund, and his behavior on the show had also seemed somehow altered. He stuttered more than usual and was nervous in the company of the kids in the studio that afternoon. Then, with a lock of hair meandering on his forehead, he leaned on the jukebox for most of his brief interview and nearly fell off of it when he went to shake Wink's hand. Elvis had initially resisted coming on the show, saying he didn't feel comfortable doing a live interview, even on local TV. Wink asked Dewey Phillips to speak with him about it, and then Elvis agreed, but only if Dewey appeared with him on camera. Had Dewey, who used Benzedrine to keep himself awake and sedatives to bring himself down, plied Elvis with pills? Wink later tried to explain it away as growing pains. He was very awkward in that era. He didn't seem to know how to act around people. He just didn't know how to be interviewed at that stage of his career. And maybe that was part of it, along with sleep deprivation. He told Hi Gardner he slept only 4 or 5 hours a night, but some of the audience thought it was more than that. Hi apparently did too, saying, "Several newspaper stories hinted that you smoked marijuana in order to work yourself into a frenzy while singing." "Well, I don't know," Elvis replied with a laugh. In 1956, drug use was mostly relegated to the underground, to Bowery dwellers, jazz musicians, and the criminally insane, and mainstream America found it both horrifying and scandalous. In billboarding the guests on the show, Gardner's secretary, Marilyn, announced, "We'll talk with veteran band leader Ted Lewis, Egyptian dancer Nadula Ace, and the unidentified author of the shocking book titled I Was a Dope Addict. And to get right into action immediately with the most controversial entertainer of the year, well, you'll hear who." On July 3rd, Elvis took a cab to New York's Pennsylvania station and once more boarded a train, this time for a 27-hour trip to Memphis. There, he would enjoy a few hours of 4th of July celebration with his parents, cousins Junior, Bobby, and Billy Smith, his aunt and uncle, Travis and Lorraine Smith, his Memphis girlfriend, Barbara Hearn, and a growing entourage that now included Red West and an overgrown Memphis boy named Arthur Hooten, whose mother had worked with Gladys at Britling's cafeteria. On the train, he listened to the quick-cut acetates of his 3 new songs on a portable record player, second-guessing himself, rethinking his vocals, wondering if his voice was too out front from the instruments. When the coach arrived in Memphis, it slowed just long enough for Elvis to disembark at a small signal stop called White Station. From there, the star of Sunday night's Steve Allen Show and Hi Gardner Calling walked home to Audubon Drive with his alcoholic and perpetually shell-shocked cousin Junior. Everybody wondered how he'd do with the fireworks that night, since Junior, a wild and unpredictable personality, had gone berserk and shot a couple of civilians in a Korean village. As usual, the yard was abuzz with fans, who normally contained themselves to the carport, except when Gladys or Vernon invited them inside, which the Presleys did quite frequently, accepting them with calm resolve. The house was especially active on this day, however, and not just for the holiday. A number of fans had traveled to Memphis for Elvis's Russwood Stadium show that night, some of them getting up the nerve to come see where he lived. Vernon was already in something of a state when Elvis walked in. The family had just had a swimming pool installed in the backyard, but the pool wouldn't fill. Now Vernon was running a hose from the kitchen sink. Elvis hurried to put on his trunks and then jumped into all of 3 feet of water, horseplaying with his cousins for Al's camera. Inside, Barbara, dressed for the evening event, sat in a taffeta scoop-neck black-on-white polka-dot dress, with cluster pearl earrings and a smart pair of black pumps completing her look. She waited for Elvis to take his shower, and then, half-naked, clad only in his pants and socks, his hair still tousled, he beckoned her into the living room to hear his acetates. Minnie May sat on the couch, craning her neck forward, trying to make out the words to Don't Be Cruel. But Elvis wanted to know what Barbara thought of all the songs, wanted her compliments and reassurance that he would have a hit. In the end, he needn't have worried. The double-sided single, Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel, sat at the top of the charts for 3 months and became the most-played jukebox record of the year. They made an odd pair, Elvis and Barbara. Al Wertheimer, taking note, found her to be a model of gentility, pert, prim, and polite as a schoolmistress, while Elvis, shirtless, with boils on his back, looked like the unruly student who spent most of his time leering at the teacher. She sat next to Minnie May for a while, just on the edge of the couch, holding her purse on her knees. "Let's dance," Elvis said, but Barbara didn't want to dance. "No, not now," she answered. She was concentrating hard on the music, but Elvis persisted, pulling her to her feet and then hugging her, moving in for a kiss. Barbara complied, but I didn't want him to be kissing me in front of his grandmother. Minnie May took the hint, saying she had to get ready for the concert that night. Elvis took Barbara's hand again, and they began dancing in the narrow space between the coffee table and the couch. Her heart wasn't in it, though, and Elvis could tell. Finally, she said she just wanted to listen. He shrugged, plopped down on the plush chair, and sulked. Wertheimer wrote in his book, Elvis 56, in the beginning. She sat on the edge of the ottoman next to the hi-fi, picked at her pearl-clustered earrings, and stared at the carpet. Elvis stared at her, clamped his lips in a pout, and glared at a different patch of the carpet. His record filled the room. Don't make me feel this way. Come on over here and love me. How do you like it? He asked. I think it's very good, she said. She liked all of his music except for Old Shep. Then he asked if she wanted to hear the new ballad, Any Way You Want Me. She stood, and Elvis folded his arms around her and pulled her to his bare chest. It was an awkward embrace. She was shy with Al there, and Wertheimer knew it was time to explore the rest of the house. That night, Elvis, dressed entirely in black, rode in a police car to nearby Restwood Stadium. Barbara sat with Vernon and Gladys, Minnie Mae, and Elvis's aunt and uncle in a VIP section near the stage. The hometown fans, so proud to have seen him on The Steve Allen Show, were already on their feet in the dilapidated old baseball park, and the noise was deafening as Elvis took the stage. "You know those people in New York aren't going to change me none," Elvis told them. "I'm going to show you what the real Elvis is like tonight." It was a sentimental and emotional evening all around. Elvis saluted his family from the edge of the stage, and Bob and Helen Neal had come back afterward, bringing their new employee, Carolyn Bradshaw, Elvis's little sweetheart from the hayride. She and Elvis had never really said goodbye, and now he spotted her. They waved and started toward each other, but it was not to be. We didn't get to say anything because all of a sudden he was just inundated with people. I don't know where all these people came from, but it looked like he'd never get away. So I just gave up and went on home. That was the last time I ever saw him. Sitting just a few rows from the stage that night was another young girl with stars in her eyes, this one just at the beginning of her relationship with Elvis. Jackie Rowland, the 190-pound blueberry from the Jacksonville, Florida show, had made good on her promise to lose weight. And even though my mother kept me almost in a bubble, Marguerite had held up her end of the bargain too, bringing Jackie, now 14 years old and 80 pounds lighter, to Memphis. They arrived at the Audubon Drive house on July 3rd, while Elvis was still in New York. Vernon saw them standing on the sidewalk, watching all the fans milling about, and came out and struck up a conversation. Marguerite explained how they happened to be there, and that Jackie had worked so hard to lose her weight and just wanted to see Elvis so much. Vernon listened sympathetically. He said if Mrs. Presley would let us in, he would come to the side door, and that's what happened. Jackie vividly recalls. Gladys, whose own weight continued to balloon, liked the personable mother-daughter, even inviting them to spend the night. They politely declined. They had a motel already, but said they would like to come back the next day, when Elvis was home. So on the 4th of July, in the afternoon, before the Restwood show, the Rowlands returned to the house to visit. The 5 of them, Elvis, his parents, and the Rowlands, sat in the living room, Gladys already in her dress for the concert. While Elvis sat between his parents on the couch, intently reading a story about himself in the newspaper, Jackie snapped his picture. Then Vernon scooted over, seeming even more the outsider, and Jackie sat down beside her idol, who draped his arm around her and held her close, his mouth so near her ear. Jackie's mother captured the moment in a snapshot, but Elvis does not appear to be a pop star greeting a fan he had met only briefly once before. Instead, both Jackie and Elvis look as natural and relaxed as if they were longtime sweethearts. Though Jackie was an only child, and I had never had a boyfriend, and the only males that came near me were my family, neither she nor Elvis seem self-conscious at being so physically affectionate in the presence of their parents. Elvis had a way of putting people at ease, but this was extraordinary. Yet Jackie says it was not precisely as it seemed. I think one of the reasons Elvis and his mother liked me was due to my reaction to his first attempt to kiss me. I was totally innocent and naive. I told him to stop it and pushed him away. You can see by my expression in the photo. Though Elvis was told no, it didn't faze or deter him. He didn't care. He just put his arm around me again and started nibbling my ears. In a light-hearted tone, he told my mother she needed to take me to a doctor because I wasn't normal. I'm sure he had never met a girl who wasn't all over him. Elvis demanded complete control in his relationships, but perhaps another reason he persisted was because Jackie looked a bit like him. Their hair color was the same, they had those light eyes, and they were the only surviving children of their parents, their mothers both having lost a baby at birth. For a brief moment, it might have seemed like Jessie and Elvis reunited. Even Jackie's name, like June's, started with the right letter. By the time Jackie left the house, there was definitely some romantic chemistry going on between the two of us. I didn't think about Elvis being a big, famous entertainer. He was just the sweet boy that I was in love with. Of course, her familiarity with the family had begun the day before. Gladys admired a stick rhinestone pin that Marguerite wore, and Mrs. Rowland sold it to her for a penny, and then showed Gladys how to store a set of sterling silverware Elvis had just bought her. After that, Gladys led Jackie through the house. I took pictures of Elvis's bedroom, his clothes closet, his messy bathroom, anything that a little 14-year-old girl would think to do. However, 21-year-old Elvis did not treat Jackie as the child she was. He sang his new song, Hound Dog, and started tickling her. You know how boys love to tease and pinch girls, calling her Goosey. From there, it grew more intense. He said, "You've got the most beautiful eyes I've ever seen," and he was really tickling me, kissing me on the cheek and the ears. Something just clicked between us, and that was it. Gladys, already guessing how Elvis would react to Jackie, had taken her alone that first day, auditioning her, as she did the older girls in whom Elvis took an interest. She sat me down and asked me if I had a boyfriend, and what kind of grades I made in school, and did I believe in Jesus. She really asked me very personal questions, but of course, at the time, I didn't think those were personal questions. I answered them, and I was happy to answer them, because I was proud of what I'd done in school and in my church. Even at 14, Jackie had the sense that she was being interviewed to see if she measured up. It was almost as if Gladys were screening Jackie in an attempt to find a younger version of herself for her son, and Gladys was direct with her about her competition. She knew about the traveling girls, as I call them, and she explained to me that Elvis hadn't sown all of his wild oats yet. It didn't bother me, because she said I still had time to grow up. In fact, when Jackie returned to Jacksonville, she was convinced that she would see Elvis again soon, and that he wanted it as much as she did. In a few weeks, an envelope arrived at Jackie's home. Elvis, who wrote few letters, had invited her and her mother to his show at Jacksonville's Florida Theater the following month. This letter was written to Mrs. Rowland and Jackie, and it's signed with Mrs. Presley's name, but it's Elvis's handwriting. He started to sign his own name, but he knew that was improper. You just didn't do things with an underage girl. The day after the Russwood concert, Elvis gave himself a well-earned 3-week vacation. It was his first real time off since becoming a national sensation. He'd always had trouble sleeping, and now sleep sometimes seemed forever out of reach, his foot just going all the time under the sheets. He drove down to Tupelo on July 7th, and then 2 days later showed up unexpectedly at June Wanico's door in Biloxi with Red West, Gene and Junior Smith, and Arthur Hooten in tow. He was living in the moment now, not really planning much of anything, except to hang with his pals, maybe do a little fishing, a little sightseeing. He put the whole party up at the Sun and Sand Hotel Court, and then moved to a villa at the Gulf Hills Dude Ranch Resort in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. But after fans keyed messages into the paint of his new car, he rented a private home. June was walking down Howard Avenue when he arrived, never dreaming he was anywhere near. There was a group of girls coming up the street, and they saw me and said, "June, Elvis Presley's at your house." Boy, I took off at a fast pace to go and see. When she got home, there was no sign of him, only a clutch of schoolgirls in her yard. Her mother, May, told her he'd been there, and that he was really ticked because he didn't have any privacy. He'd left a message for her to call the Sun and Sand. The whole town seemed to be on the phone, though, and when she finally got through, Elvis gave her grief about it. "You told everybody in Biloxi I was coming." She tossed it right back. "I didn't even know you were coming. You arrive in a white Cadillac convertible with a Memphis tag and your sideburns flapping in the wind. Come on." Elvis's presence escalated the rumor flying around Biloxi that he and June were engaged. A New Orleans radio station, WNOE, picked up on it, reporting it on the air, which sent the Colonel into orbit. Parker ordered Elvis to drive to New Orleans immediately and deny it. Unannounced, Elvis walked into the station and did an on-air interview. "Elvis, how are you?" the interviewer began. "Fine. How are you, sir?" "Wonderful. When did you come into town?" "Well, I just came in a few minutes ago." "You drove up from—" "A few minutes ago." Yeah, I was in Biloxi and I heard on the radio where I was supposed to be engaged to somebody, so I came down here to see who I was supposed to be engaged to. Well, just what is the story? Are you engaged to anybody? The girl they were talking about, June Juanico, I've dated a couple times. We're not engaged. Are you serious about anybody? I'm serious about my career right now. The interviewer gave it a rest, asked about his next release and his career, and then put him in the hot seat again. How old are you, Elvis? 21. What age do you think might be the best for you to get married? I never thought much about it. In fact, I have never thought of marriage. I'll say this much. I'm not thinking of it right now, but if I were to decide to get married at all, it wouldn't be a secret. I mean, I'd let everybody know about it, but I have no plans for marriage. I have no specific loves, and I'm not engaged, and I'm not going steady with nobody or nothing like that. Well, you know how this whole thing started last night. Excuse me for butting in, but I don't know how it got started. But everywhere I go, I'm either engaged or married, or I've got 4 or 5 kids or something like that. But you're not. Everywhere I go. No. You're as free as the breeze. That's right. Elvis's interviewer then tried to move on. Well, Elvis, thank you so very much again, and we wish you lots and lots of good luck in your continued meteoric rise to stardom. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed talking to you, and I hope that we got the little rumor cleared up because it's just a rumor and nothing more. If it wasn't, then I wouldn't care for telling anybody. I wouldn't be ashamed of it. Why don't you say it just one more time so people still don't get the wrong idea? Well, I'm not engaged, if that's what it's supposed to be. He got the heck out of there then, and he and June and the gang went to the Pontchartrain Beach Amusement Park to blow off a little steam before heading back to Biloxi. The next morning, June awakened to a phone call from a reporter from the New Orleans Item. Did I kiss him goodnight? What do you think? He's wonderful. A day or so later, they went deep-sea fishing on the boat, the Aunt Jenny, with June's mother and her boyfriend Eddie Bellman. Elvis looked out at the blue water and thought about his upcoming tour of Florida. He still wished he could take his parents to see the ocean, but maybe he could get them to come down to Biloxi now. That way, he could stay down longer with June, too, and not have to worry Gladys. To his surprise, Gladys and Vernon said yes, and the Presleys arrived on Friday, July 13th, staying the weekend. Elvis and June took them out on the Aunt Jenny, and then to New Orleans to see the sights before they returned to Memphis. When they parted, Elvis embraced his mother. She would just dig into him, June noticed. You could see tears well up in her eyes any time she left him. His daddy came around the door where his mama was getting in, and he was shaking his daddy's hand. But Vernon was not really that affectionate, not like she was. Elvis was back in Memphis by July 20th, but apparently lovesick, he returned to Biloxi 9 days later. He talked it over with his mother, and contrary to what he'd told WNOE radio only 10 days earlier, he was serious enough about June to think about marriage. But he wanted her to wait 3 years. He said, I can't get married right away. I promised the Colonel I wouldn't do anything that would affect my career. Will you wait for me? June hated the nuisance of his fame. It was getting so that if they wanted to do anything, they had to wait until the middle of the night to go out so he wouldn't be mobbed. But she was crazy insane about Elvis, so she said yes, she would wait. Elvis's parents came back down to Biloxi to celebrate. Now he wanted June to go with him on his 9-day tour of Florida, ending with a 10th day in New Orleans. It was due to start in Miami in just a few days, on August 3rd. June's mother, May, pitched a fit. It wasn't decent, and said no. Really, what were they thinking? Only 4 months earlier, Elvis had spoken with Gladys about asking Barbara Hearn to go with him on his tour of Texas, but it never got any further than that. It was very embarrassing to stand there and listen to Mrs. Presley, Barbara remembers, but I loved her for it. She said, her mother will never let her go off like that, and even if she did, I wouldn't let her go. Barbara is a lady, and I want you to treat her like one. But now Gladys spoke with June's mother and promised that Elvis would take great care of her daughter. You can trust him, Gladys said. May weakened, and June packed her bag. That left the Colonel as the only person not in favor of the arrangement. Elvis knew how he would react. so he didn't even tell him he was bringing June along. But trouble erupted the first night, when Elvis played the Olympic Theater in Miami. June tried to dodge the Colonel backstage, but the press spotted her and, finding out her last name, called her mother for comment. They said, "How do you feel about your daughter being on tour with Elvis?" Because they made it sound like something nasty, Mother said, "My daughter has a very level head, and his parents assured me she couldn't be in better hands." And then she made the fatal mistake of saying, "Elvis has asked June to marry him." That's when it really hit the fan. Parker took Elvis aside and sputtered about his morals, so June told the Miami News, "Right now, he's married to his career." And Elvis was instructed to say, "Well, I have about 25 girls that I date." It wasn't much of a lie, and one more old girlfriend hoped to speak with him again. 17-year-old Regis Wilson, his prom date from Humes, the one who had moved to Florida without telling him, was in the audience. Now she wanted to explain that she'd been too ashamed to share her family circumstances with him, and she hoped he forgave her for leaving like that. She also had some news for him. She was married now, and she wanted to introduce her husband, Herb Vaughn. After the concert, she went to the backstage door, but security wouldn't let her in. "But I know Elvis," she told the guard. "Sure you do," he said. She was disappointed and somehow knew it was her last chance. But at least a decade later, her brother, Jim Wilson, who was Elvis's age and had known him from Humes and Lauderdale courts, saw him at the Memphian Theater. The theater manager, Dickie Tucker, who had also grown up in the courts, let Jim into one of the singer's private gatherings. Elvis was watching Marlon Brando's The Wild One, and Jim made his way over and introduced himself. Elvis remembered him and wanted to know whatever happened to his sweet little girl. "I just wish I had had the nerve to tell him goodbye," Regis says today. "That is something I have to live with." By the time Elvis roared into Jacksonville on August 10th, he had cut a swath through Tampa, Lakeland, St. Petersburg, Orlando, and Daytona Beach. Colonel Parker, who'd started out in Florida first as a carny and then as a young promoter, knew every inch of the state, and with the help of Mae Axton, his crack publicity contact, he turned the tour into the epicenter of the national Elvis movement. Blanketing the region with promotions that framed Elvis just short of a sideshow attraction, he packed the auditoriums with ticket buyers who ranged from the merely curious to the intently carnal. Based on the pandemonium Elvis generated the last 2 times he played Jacksonville, the Colonel booked him for 6 shows over 2 days, all at the Florida Theater, a medium-sized venue that held about 2,200 people. On assignment from Collier's magazine was photographer Jay Leviton, who, like Al Wertheimer, had almost unrestricted access to the cresting star backstage, on stage, over dinner, even in bed at the Roosevelt Hotel. He was very casual, very unguarded. I was surprised Colonel Parker didn't control things more. As Wertheimer before him, Leviton would put poetry in the pictures, particularly when Elvis would lie face down on stage, stretching full out on the microphone, saying things every girl in the audience wanted to hear. June would try to stay out of Leviton's lens, but he would still find her backstage, along with Red West and Junior and Bobby Smith. Also on hand that day was juvenile court judge Marion W. Gooding, a servant and crusader for all that was good and upright, and who was determined there would not be a repeat of Elvis's last trips to Jacksonville, when aroused fans ripped nearly all of Elvis's clothes off. Pressured by community leaders from Miami and Daytona Beach, who warned that the depraved singer was swinging his pelvis and heading north, and it was no laughing matter, Judge Gooding had met with them, as well as with the Optimists Club and the National Congress of the PTA. All of them were up in arms, frozen stiff with outrage and bewilderment at Elvis's bizarrely spasmodic and purely sexual moves. They saw Elvis as arrogant, sneering, dangerous, and defiant, the very embodiment of the 1950s juvenile delinquent, and insisted the judge warn him to tone down his libidinous intensity. "They really wanted Daddy to shut down his performance," said the judge's daughter, Marilyn Gooding. Daddy's heart wasn't in that, but he did want Elvis to perform clean. They had me convinced that no teenage girl was safe around Elvis Presley, Judge Gooding said years later, chuckling at the Times. They wanted me to have him watched at the theater, and they wanted his hotel room watched. They had him pictured to me as a real villain. Looking back on it today, of course, it wouldn't even stir a ripple. Not a single ripple. But in 1956, Judge Gooding took his task with the utmost seriousness and demanded to see the performer and his manager in his chambers before the show. Photographer Leviton went along, capturing the disdain on Gooding's grumpy face and the flushed emotion, part shame, part anger, on Elvis's. The judge warned him he would be at the first show to make sure Elvis did as he was told, and that he had prepared warrants charging him with impairing the morals of minors. He would serve them, too, he said, if Elvis wiggled his hips and put obscenity and vulgarity in front of our children. As if for proof, deputies would be stationed in the wings. Afterward, the singer told reporters, "I can't figure out what I'm doing wrong. I know my mother approves of what I'm doing." And the judge called Elvis a sweet, gentle kid, with the sort of good manners that we associate with Southern politeness. Still, the judge attended the first show at 3:30. On stage, Elvis opened with Heartbreak Hotel and threw his hips out once. "I'm going to put him in jail, sure as anything," Gooding whispered to the lawyer for the theater. But then Elvis caught himself and had his fun. "Wait a minute, I can't do this. They won't let me do this here," he told the audience, and then he wiggled his little finger suggestively in place of his usual movements. It thrilled the crowd, who found the finger both hilarious and deeply erotic. "The kids went nuts any time he did anything," June says. "He could just make a funny face and they would scream. These teenagers would just go crazy." The judge went backstage afterward and told Elvis and the colonel that all was well. Secretly, they'd reached a compromise anyway, the colonel posting bond and Elvis joining the American Guild of Variety Artists, which also represented exotic dancers. But Elvis was still wounded. It hurt his feelings, June remembers. Elvis was not vulgar. He did not do a bump and grind. He swiveled his hips slightly, but no forward movement, no pelvic thrusts. Yes, the boy kept his word, the judge told his wife, Eunice. He went back to his chambers and telephoned me and told me how clean the show was, and he said, "Tell the girls to line up their little friends, and you can put them in the station wagon and bring them to the next show." So Judge Gooding's wife, their 3 daughters, and their girlfriends all went down to the Florida Theater. Even they roared when Elvis dedicated Hound Dog to the judge. "Everybody in the audience got the biggest charge out of that," said Marilyn. At the Roosevelt after the show, Elvis told June all about it. "Baby, you should have been there. Every time DJ did his thing on the drums, I wiggled my finger and the girls went wild. I never heard screams like that in my life. I showed them sons of bitches, calling me vulgar. Baby, you don't think I'm vulgar, do you?" She assured him that she didn't. Then, to lighten the mood, Elvis put a pair of June's panties on his head and strode around the room. Gladys, later hearing about Judge Gooding, told her son to never, ever go back to Jacksonville. There was nothing for him there except trouble. But he had made some new fans. The judge's grandson, Tony, would grow up to idolize Elvis and plaster Presley posters all over his walls. And the last Christmas the judge was alive, he gave his wife an album of Elvis singing religious songs. At some point during the Jacksonville gig, Elvis was to meet with Andrea June Stevens of Atlanta, Georgia, who'd won a contest, Win a Date with Elvis, through Hit Parader magazine. She'd written an essay about why she wanted to meet him. But when the moment came, the dark-haired girl was nervous standing in the corridor at the hotel. She'd also had wicked cramps on the flight, and the butterflies didn't go away until they opened the door to Elvis's hotel room. Then there he was, in black pants and loafers, white socks and a white shirt with a comb, a couple of teeth noticeably missing, sticking out of his breast pocket. He accented it all with a matching white knit tie and a white belt slid over to the side so the buckle wouldn't bump his guitar when he played. He called Andrea June honey and made her feel at ease on the sofa next to him, introducing her to his cousins. She was his age, or thereabouts, and soon she saw he wasn't really so intimidating at all. After a little while, Elvis stood up and put on his Kelly green jacket. They were going out to eat. After all, Andrea June had won a dinner date. But as they left the hotel entrance, the sight of him was just too much for one young girl who fainted dead away, going down like a bowling pin. Somebody carried her to a couch inside, and Elvis, worried, stayed with her, calling her name and putting her hand up to his face. Finally, she came to, embarrassed that everybody was staring down at her, and Red got a souvenir program for Elvis to sign. It was just for her, Elvis told her, and please, next time she saw him, would she mind not fainting? Now there wasn't much time left, so he and June ended up just with a quick bite at a diner. He wolfed down a cheeseburger, but Andrea June's tummy still didn't feel right, and so she passed. Back at the Roosevelt after Elvis's last performance, he called June from the lounge and said, "You've got to get your butt down here. I've told June all about you." June was confused. "You told June all about me?" "Yeah, her name is June, too. Get on down here. She knows you're here. We're having a good time." She went on down to the bar and found a crowd of young people and reporters. Elvis was playing the piano and motioned for June to sit on the side of the bench with him. Then he excused himself, saying, "Okay, my two baby girls, I'll be right back." Andrea June turned to Elvis's real date. "Do you realize how lucky you are?" she said. "What do you mean?" June asked. "Elvis could have any girl in the whole world, and you're the one. He can't shut up talking about you." June liked her. Elvis was gone visiting with the guys, so we talked for a good 15 minutes that night. We got to be good friends and even stayed in touch. But Elvis wasn't just talking with the guys. He was off seeing about 14-year-old Jackie Rowland and her mother, his invited guests. The Colonel had admitted them to an afternoon show via the back door of the theater, and now Elvis had achieved the slick trick of getting 2 of his 3 dates to entertain each other while he checked about the third. The next night at the theater, Elvis would take Jackie off to a little prop room to show her how to kiss in a grown-up way. I had never kissed a boy before. Elvis was a very loving and gentle teacher. Her mother caught them, but still Elvis had time to say, "You know, when you grow up, you are going to be mine." It was a solemn moment, as Jackie remembers. I said, "Yes, I know that." The moonlight was coming in, and it was so romantic. I still remember his scent and the warmth from his body. Then it was time for him to go on stage, and he paused a moment and told Jackie, "Don't be cruel" would always be for her. Don't be cruel to a heart that's true. He had invited both of the Rowlands back to the hotel after the show, and when they arrived, he was still upset about Judge Gooding. He came out of the bar, and tears were running down his face. He was hurt very badly by that situation, and he hugged me and just held on and cried on my shoulder. And me being 14 at the time, what can you do at 14? You're not a grown woman. You're still a little girl. He told my mother that she could go, that he would take very, very good care of me, and my mother said absolutely not. He said, "I really promise, Mrs. Rowland, I will take good care of her. I won't let anything happen to her." She said, "And you're going to take her in that bar?" "No, sir, you are not. She is underage, and my little girl is going home with me." Being the obedient child that I was, I didn't open my mouth, but inside I was dying. And so he turned around and went back into the bar, and we left. Of course, I was so embarrassed. I thought, I'll never get to see him again. But Jackie would hear from Elvis through the early 1960s, and when she left that night, she had a wonderful souvenir. Her mother had snapped a playful photo of them lost in each other, staring moon-eyed. We thought we were alone. We didn't even know she had taken the photo. And Marguerite slyly got Elvis to sign the back of one of the Audubon Drive photos, later comparing the handwriting to that on the letter purportedly from Gladys. Jackie and her mother continued to attend numerous Elvis concerts around the area until he went into the Army in 1958. Years later, when her mother died, Jackie was stunned to find more letters from Elvis and Marguerite's belongings, one written on pink stationery 2 weeks after the Florida theater shows. Marguerite had kept them from her all those years. I really trusted my mother. I thought that either Elvis or Mrs. Presley was calling her and inviting us for the different shows and visits. Now I really regret not knowing more. But dating a rock and roll star was like a Southern Baptist becoming Catholic. Though Marguerite was a good chaperone, Elvis and Jackie had other moments where he and I got off together and had some time to share with one another. One such event occurred backstage at the Florida Theater. Elvis and Jackie sat in a pair of chairs and talked while Elvis's scary cousin, Junior, perched on the stairs nearby. Suddenly, everyone noticed that the strap on Jackie's sundress had slipped down and fallen off her shoulder. Junior made a smart remark, something to the effect of, "Yeah, baby, take it all off." Elvis jumped up out of that chair, grabbed him, shook him, and said, "Don't you dare talk to her like that. She's my girlfriend and she's a lady." Predictably, they never had sex. We kissed and hugged, but he never touched me inappropriately. And chances are they wouldn't have, even if Jackie had been willing. Elvis wasn't having intercourse with June either. Already, Elvis's reputation as a sex symbol was becoming a burden. In the 1960s, he would tell Larry Geller, his spiritual advisor and a member of his entourage, that in the early days of his fame, he had relations with so many women that he was hospitalized for exhaustion. Whether that was the reason behind his 1955 hospital visit in Jacksonville isn't known, but according to Geller, the incident taught Elvis that he should not live his life as a sex machine, and that sex without love meant nothing, even though he could not always control himself. Elvis's label as a sex god, then, hampered him psychologically. Women assumed, from his image and his movements on stage, that he was a lover of legendary proportions, but he was insecure about his sexual prowess and felt inadequate once his lovemaking moved beyond dry humping and other adolescent practices. And since he was brought up to please, and pleasing is part of any entertainer's personality, he feared that he might not measure up to a woman's expectations in bed. His apprehension was so incapacitating that it often made him withdraw from actual intercourse and extend his foreplay instead. This was also a factor in his gravitation toward 13 and 14-year-old girls. At that level of sexual development, young teens of his generation were likely to still be innocents, satisfied to simply make out and abstain from intercourse, precisely where Elvis felt most at ease. He wanted virgins, he called them cherries, so that he might mold them sexually, but also so they wouldn't have anyone to compare him to as a lover. That way, they would be less likely to critique or pass judgment on his performance. But Elvis failed to realize the damage that sexual flirtation could have on young girls, especially coming from someone so famous and charismatic. Though Jackie went on to marry, once you'd kissed Elvis, it was all downhill after that. I guess you could say the flame still sizzles. Her sentiment is common among women who enjoyed any involvement with Elvis, particularly if he was the first male with whom they were involved, and the divorce rate among them is high. Jackie herself divorced after nearly 42 years of marriage. One of the ironies of her story is that Jackie and Eunice Gooding, Judge Gooding's wife, became good friends. While Jackie could see both sides of the issue, Elvis never did. After his last performance at the Florida Theater on August 11th, according to June Wanico, Elvis had a message for the judge and his cronies in attendance. "You know how Elvis always said, 'Thank you very much'? I heard it just as clear as day. He said, 'Fuck you very much. Fuck you very much.'" Everybody was screaming, but all the members of his entourage heard it. He did it twice, and he looked over at me and grinned. Once they were together in the room, June asked him if she'd heard him correctly. "You heard correctly," he said. The tour wound up the next day in New Orleans on August 12th. In the Big Easy, where almost anything went, Elvis gave his performance without restraint and even received the key to the city. It had been an incredible 10 days, during which he'd made $20,000, plus a $7,500 commission on souvenirs. As usual, his thoughts turned to Gladys after the show. He knew she always worried about him, even though both Elvis and Gladys had turned June into a surrogate mother. That night, he was so exhausted he had chills and a fever. Perspiration gathered in hot beads on his forehead, and then gave way to cold sweats. He was just at the point of collapsing in the bed, but he said, "I have to call my mother before I go to sleep." When he got her on the phone, as June remembers, he told her, "I'll be home in a couple of days. Don't worry about me, Mama. June is right here." Anytime he called her, he would say, "Here, talk to her." So he handed me the phone, and she said, "How is he? Is he getting enough rest? Is he eating? Don't let him run himself crazy, June." I said, "Don't worry. I'm right here with him." Still, he was so keyed up and sick that it took its toll. Contrary to his normal routine with June, Elvis was unable to relax and sleep. Whenever we went to bed, he just died. He died. But on this night, he was back to his old restlessness. They had a suite at the hotel, and June moved into the living room so as not to disturb him. But that didn't seem to help either. He sat straight up in his bed and he called, "June, June, come in here." I went in and he was sweating. He was trembling and he said, "I had a horrible dream. I was in a coffin and my mother was looking down, crying over me." June saw it as more evidence of a premonition he'd had that he was going to die young. He'd mentioned several times, "I'm not going to be here long." Yet the timing was also curious. June had refused a ring, accepting only a radio with rhinestones all over it for her birthday. But it was the first time he'd gotten so close to really committing to a woman. His dream, then, seems more about the death of his lifestyle, about anxiety over marriage, of breaking his bond with Gladys, than about physical demise. Now, in his fevered state, he kept saying, "I can't leave my mother. My mother needs me. I can't leave her. She needs me." It was a real dream to him. Things just seemed to be happening quicker than he could absorb them, and there was never any time to think about any of it. He was scared about so many things, scared he might lose it all. He'd even mentioned it to Jackie, a mere child. But he couldn't quit obsessing about it. What if it all just ended tomorrow? 4 days later, on August 16th, Elvis would leave for Hollywood to begin his first movie. 10. Hillbillies in Hollywood. Elvis arrived in Los Angeles with his cousins Gene and Junior, and immediately after checking into his 11th floor suite at the Knickerbocker Hotel, a favorite of show business luminaries on their way up or down, the trio went to Long Beach Amusement Park, where they reportedly blew $750. It was a huge sum of money to throw away on bumper cars and crap carnival food in 1956. But Elvis was hardly a young sophisticate, and Gene, never a smart boy, with a speech impediment that made him seem even dimmer, appeared such a bumpkin as to barely be believed. Together, with the eternally bewildered Junior, they were hillbillies in Hollywood, and the film community would nearly fall over itself to see who could make the most derisive comment or the cruelest joke. Vernon and Gladys also had trouble believing where fate had led them, and Elvis was mystified to explain his success. "I don't know what it is," he said. "I just fell into it, really. My daddy and I were laughing about it just the other day. He looked at me and said, 'What happened, El? The last thing I remember is I was working in a can factory and you were driving a truck.' And I remember how, after something big happened along the way, I was sitting at home and found my mama staring at me. I asked her why, and she just shook her head and said, 'I don't believe it. We all feel the same about it still. It just caught us up, but I sure hope it doesn't stop.'" Elvis had been to Los Angeles before, both for television and show dates, but now the City of Angels seemed to be one big play lot, offering up the opportunity to fulfill every dream he'd ever had. His producer on The Reno Brothers was David Weisbart, who had brought one of Elvis's favorite movies, Rebel Without a Cause, starring his idol, James Dean, to the screen. Within 4 days of his arrival, Elvis would meet Nick Adams, a close friend of Dean and part of a Hollywood clique of talented but troubled young actors who embraced the live fast, die young, and leave a beautiful corpse philosophy. Elvis had cried when Dean died, and now it looked as if he were about to be welcomed by all of the late actor's acolytes and brethren, the in-crowd that included Dennis Hopper, Adams's roommate at the time, Russ Tamblyn, another movie hood, then married to Venetia Stevenson, whom Elvis would later date, and Sal Mineo and Natalie Wood, who were still teenagers and going to school. It made his head spin, even though he didn't know that the reckless Adams, who was said to use pills, and who was on probation after being arrested for speeding 9 times in 1 year, hoped to trade on the friendship to win a part in Elvis's film. In fact, Elvis had beat Adams out for the supporting actor role, and most of the larger studios were loath to touch him. The picture, directed by Oscar winner Robert D. Webb, was cast very late, and though Joanne Woodward had originally been slated for the female lead, by now Elvis knew that Deborah Paget had won the part. Elvis was ecstatic. Only months earlier, Elvis had told Milton Berle in a television skit, "Really, Mr. Berle, the type I dig is someone like that Deborah Paget. She's real gone." She, too, had nice things to say about him, even if she gave him a backhanded compliment. "I'll admit that my impression of Elvis before I met him was the same as many others who don't know him. I figured he must be some kind of moron. Now, I think the best way to describe his work is to say it's inspired." They would circle around each other as principal photography began. In Robert Buckner's screenplay, set in Texas at the end of the Civil War, Elvis plays Clint Reno, snared in a love triangle with his older brother, Vance, Richard Egan, and Kathy, the woman they love, Paget. It was an odd role in which to make his screen debut, but Elvis gave it his all and tried not to be intimidated by his co-stars, who included the fine character actress Mildred Dunnock, twice nominated for an Academy Award, as his mother. Critics would pan the novice actor. He was, after all, an easy target. But Dunnock was surprised at his solid performance. "When I came back from making the picture, my friends saw it and said, 'Why, Millie, this boy can act.' This rather threw me because I said I had spent 25 years trying to learn how to act, and Elvis Presley hadn't spent 25 minutes. So I do not in any way depreciate his value as an actor." The truth was, Dunnock, a fellow Southerner, had taken a shine to Elvis, and when he confessed to her that he didn't really know what to do, how to make the lines ring true, she took it upon herself to coach him. First, the former schoolteacher had to educate him in the art of theatrical projection. Elvis would have a line like, "Can't do it, Ma, can't do it," and he would say it really pleasant and nice, but I'd tell him to say it like he really meant it. And after a certain number of tries, he would finally say with strong emphasis, "I can't do it, Ma, I can't do it." And Mr. Webb would say, "Shoot." In one of the film's most crucial scenes, the family was led to believe that the Yankees had killed Clint's brother. He really hadn't been killed, Dunnock remembered, but my baby Elvis was upstairs and I was in the kitchen cooking. There was only one line of dialogue in this scene, and it was mine. All the rest was plain action. I was going to say it firmly, so I rehearsed it and rehearsed it. The lighting men decided what they were going to do, and we sat down and drank Coca-Colas and waited for about 2 hours. As Dunnock told the story, the director finally said, "Everything seems ready, so let's rehearse it one time." Elvis said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Webb." Then the director took Elvis through it, saying, "In this scene, the Yankees come by horse up into the backyard, which you can see from your window upstairs. You come down and go to the window and see those Yankees kill your brother. You go to the sideboard, open the drawer, and pull out a gun. You start across that floor to go meet those damn Yankees, and end of scene." "Yes, sir," Elvis said confidently. "The Yankees are going to rap on the door," Webb continued. "I'll go, 'Ready, lights, shoot,' then I'll make a knocking sound, and that's your cue to come down those stairs. Understand?" "Yes, sir." Webb called for action and rapped out the knock. In Dunnock's retelling, Elvis came down those stairs, went to that sideboard, took out that gun, and when I said my line, "Put that gun down, son," well, he dropped it right away. Mr. Webb said, "Cut, cut, oh my God, what are you doing? You're supposed to keep on going." Elvis said, "She told me to put it down." Most actresses of Dunnock's caliber would have held her head, livid at having to put up with so inexperienced an actor. But Elvis had gotten to the real mother in her, and she chose to frame his blunder as an asset. You see, for the first time he heard me. Before, he was just thinking about what he was doing and how he was going about it. It's a funny story, but I also think it's a story about a beginner who had the first requirement of acting, which is to believe in what you're doing. Though Elvis hoped he would play the part as a straight dramatic role and do no singing, Colonel Parker dashed that dream straight away. Seeing how Hollywood's The Blackboard Jungle spurred the chart-topping success of Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock the year before, the Colonel insisted that Fox and RCA make the most of a similar opportunity. Parker had no faith that Elvis would amount to anything as an actor, and got him involved with motion pictures primarily as a vehicle to sell records. The Ken Darby Trio was part of the session team that replaced Scotty Moore and Bill Black on the soundtrack. The producers found their Memphis sound far too raw, and Darby wrote all 4 songs for the film, including Love Me Tender, a massaging of the Civil War ballad Aura Lee, written by W. W. Fosdick and George R. Poulton. The Colonel, intending to bleed every penny out of the film, insisted that Elvis be cut in as a songwriter, so Darby officially credited Love Me Tender, which inspired the title change of the picture, to both Elvis and Vera Matson, Darby's wife. The singer hadn't written one bar of it, but he now had a music publishing company administered by Parker's old friends, the brothers Julian and Gene Auerbach. Critics would point out that Elvis's dance steps during the 3 remaining songs, We're Gonna Move, Let Me, and Poor Boy, were totally wrong for the period and made the scene seem out of place. But Elvis fans didn't care. They wanted to see him move. The title track became an instant hit, the single lodging in the #1 spot for 5 weeks in November and December 1956, and the accompanying EP reaching number 35. The Colonel was happy, and Weisbart was too. The film made back its $1 million budget within 3 days. Elvis was proud to do the title song because it showed a side of him that had all but disappeared. "People think all I can do is belt," Elvis told reporter Army Archard, breaking into a sample of the song. "I used to sing nothing but ballads before I went professional. I love ballads." But he was ticked about not being able to use Scotty and Bill on the record, though they appeared with him on The Ed Sullivan Show on September 9th. Sullivan had been injured in a car accident in August, and so actor Charles Laughton filled in for him in New York. Still, it was an amazing opportunity for Elvis, especially since Sullivan had publicly vowed he'd never have such a vulgar personality on his program, all the while negotiating with the Colonel, even calling him backstage at the Steve Allen Show, and shattering the industry price ceiling to get him. Since the performance came smack in the middle of filming Love Me Tender, Elvis was allowed to appear live from the CBS studios in Los Angeles. More than 80% of the national audience watched him sing Love Me Tender, Ready Teddy, Don't Be Cruel, and 2 verses of Hound Dog. Among them was 11-year-old Priscilla Ann Beaulieu of Austin, Texas, whose stepfather Paul, a career Air Force officer, had bought her Elvis's debut album at the PX. "I thought it might be something she would like. It seemed like music for her generation." But once he and his wife Anne heard the music, they didn't have such a high opinion. "Frankly, we forbade her to watch the show," he remembers. "But forbidden fruit is that much sweeter," Priscilla would later say. "I cracked open my door just enough to see the television set." So many extraordinary things were happening for Elvis that he sometimes seemed oblivious to his old way of life. He was having a blast, being a movie star, meeting beautiful women, staying up all hours, and doing and saying whatever he wanted. Nothing inhibited him, or if it did, he didn't act like it. In fact, fame emboldened him. He could be both playful and arrogant and get away with it, even with steely female reporters. Or at least he thought he could. When a young New York journalist came to visit him during the filming, he flirted with her shamelessly. "A press agent came by to tell me I had had enough time with Elvis," she wrote. "I started to leave, and Elvis, who was still sprawled on the couch, darted out his hand and caught my foot. 'Maybe she's shy. Maybe she'd like to be alone with me,' he said." The press agent shrugged and laughed. "I asked Elvis to take his hand off my foot. 'Okay,' he said, looking up under heavy lids. 'I'm just spoofing you.' I asked Elvis how he felt about girls who threw themselves at him. Again, the heavy-lidded look. 'I usually take them,' he said, watching my face for the shock value of his words. He grinned. Hell, he said, you know, I'm kind of having fun with you because you're so smart. Colonel Parker had used William Morris to broker Elvis's movie deals, building on his relationship with Abe Lastfogel, the diminutive head of their respected talent agency from his Eddie Arnold days. Lastfogel had assigned Leonard Hershan directly to Elvis, since, as Hershan puts it, the three of us negotiated the Love Me Tender deal with Fox, so I considered that my deal as well as anybody's. But though Elvis was Morris's client and not Parker, the Colonel never let the agency deal directly with his star, insisting that everything go through him. Parker particularly didn't trust Hershan, fearing that he would make himself too powerful with Elvis and get in the Colonel's way. Parker all but banned Hershan from Presley's movie sets and then went about finding a mole within the agency to report on their plans. Byron Raphael was a 22-year-old agent in training at the Morris Agency in Beverly Hills in 1956, working his way up in the mailroom. One day, he delivered an envelope to Elvis's outsized manager on the Fox lot. The Colonel sized up the small, affable young man and immediately appropriated him. "Tell your bosses you're going to work for me," and made Raphael his spy, both within the Morris office and inside Elvis's camp. Since Raphael was only a year older than Elvis and obsessed with music, it was an easy alliance. On September 10th, midway through the shooting, Nick Adams, also believed to be a sentry for the Colonel, reporting on Elvis's comings and goings, arranged for 18-year-old Natalie Wood to visit Elvis on the set. Elvis, who had gotten so caught up in her Oscar-nominated performance in Rebel Without a Cause, tittered like a schoolboy at the thought of meeting her. Natalie, attracted to bad boy types and dark personalities, was just as intrigued with him. But Elvis didn't know she was a deeply disturbed girl, or that she was tormented by the conflict between her real self, born Natasha Zakharenko to Russian immigrants, and the alluring persona of Natalie Wood, a co-creation of Hollywood and her ambitious mother, Maria. Wood learned early to please the grown-ups, and the teenager, who had begun working in films at the age of 6, had a wild child reputation, drinking, casually falling in and out of relationships. Like Elvis, she couldn't stand to be alone, and using her sexuality to further her career. Elvis would eventually come to dub her Mad Nat. The Colonel asked Byron to walk Natalie over to the soundstage, and I could tell they were hot for each other the moment they met, Raphael remembered. A devilish grin crossed Elvis's face, and he invited Natalie to visit him in his suite at the posh Beverly Wilshire Hotel that night. Although Elvis had been in Hollywood only a matter of weeks, his parties, attended by movie royalty and young fans alike, were becoming legendary, whether at the Knickerbocker or the more staid Beverly Wilshire, at the corner of Rodeo Drive and Wilshire Boulevard. Glenn Glenn, an aspiring California country singer who became good friends with the band, found that every time you went to see Elvis up at the Knickerbocker, there would always be 200 or so girls out in front. They had a special guard that made sure that girls could not get inside the hotel unless they were actually staying there. They were standing out front hoping Elvis would come out. Among them were sisters Sharon and Mary Jo Sheely of Tony, Laguna Beach, California, both rabid Elvis fans. Sharon, the older of the two, looked at her sister one day and just told her that we were going to Hollywood. It was very matter-of-fact with me. Mary Jo remembered it the same way. When she got her driver's license, she came into my room and said, "Josie, come on, we're going to meet Elvis." When they arrived, they were surprised to find that thousands of girls had the same idea. It wasn't quite as easy as I had planned it out to be, Sharon realized. So I took Mary Jo home and said, I've got to think of something better than this. The following week, Sharon put her hair up, slathered on a generous amount of makeup to look older than her 16 years, and checked into the Knickerbocker Hotel, sneaking her sister in later. Now, with the first part of their mission accomplished, the Sheely girls had only to meet Elvis. Sharon again led the way. On a very lucky occasion, when there was no guard on his floor, we knocked on his door and they opened it. The first thing I saw through the crack was Elvis sitting backward in a chair, straddling it. I looked into those gorgeous blue eyes of his, and I couldn't believe that I was staring eye to eye with Elvis Presley. And he said, "Well, don't just stand there, come on in." Sharon strode right into the room, but when she turned to her sister, Mary Jo was paralyzed behind me. Her legs wouldn't move, and he literally got up and walked over and picked her up. Now Elvis turned his full attention to 15-year-old Mary Jo. He looked at me and he said, "Are you a goody-goody girl?" And I said, "What's a goody-goody girl?" He said, "Never mind." And with that, he gave me the longest, most passionate, memorable kiss I've ever had. Then he looked me straight in the eyes and said, "There, if that gets you pregnant, I'll marry you." He invited the teenagers to stay and have hamburgers and said if they were in town the following week to come back up again. From there, it just became a regular thing, said Sharon. Every weekend we would go and hang out with Elvis Presley. Sharon later parlayed her music contacts into a songwriting career, starting with Ricky Nelson's first #1, Poor Little Fool. But the thrill of being around Elvis never diminished, at least not for Mary Jo. Just walking into the room, he had that presence that he had on stage. He was gorgeous, kind, and had a great sense of humor. The visits continued for years. In 1957, he used to put me on his lap and sing Young and Beautiful to me, Mary Jo remembers, which not many people can say. When Natalie Wood arrived at the Beverly Wilshire about 9 o'clock on the night of September 10th, she found more than a dozen people in the living room, ranging from Elvis's cousins and their dates to the young girls he'd invited up from the fan huddle downstairs. Elvis had just gotten out of the shower after heavy petting with one of the more willing fans, and he was wearing a white smoking jacket with the letters EP embroidered in gold. He immediately gave Natalie a hug and asked if she'd like to see some of the dailies from the film. She said yes, recognizing the code, and they disappeared into the bedroom. 20 minutes later, Byron was surprised to see a furious Natalie storm out the door. "What's the matter with your boss?" she demanded, glaring at him. "Doesn't he know how to screw? He's all hands and no action." Byron fumbled for excuses, but Natalie kept raving. "I thought he was supposed to be the king of the sack, but he doesn't want to screw me." Elvis's guests began to scramble, leaving only Jean sitting there as Natalie continued her rant. "What's Elvis going to do? Tell his buddies I'm not sexy enough for him?" Byron assured her Elvis wouldn't do any such thing. Natalie glanced back at Jean with a smirk on her face and taunted him. "I think all you guys are homos," she said. Then, to Byron's amazement, the Hollywood star propositioned the agent in training, and he took her up on it. Suddenly, he was on top of her, frantically pulling off her pedal pushers as she worked to remove his pants. She guided him into her, and he pumped fast and furiously, and she did too. In seconds, they were both glistening with sweat. But she criticized his performance, and he worried that he hadn't used a rubber. Natalie pushed him out of her and quickly dressed. "You're okay," she said matter-of-factly. "But tell Elvis if he wants to go out with me again, I want to go all the way. You can also tell him I'm the best fuck in town." And then she left. Byron glanced over at the bedroom and saw Elvis standing in the doorway. He didn't know how much he'd witnessed, but the singer simply closed the door and never mentioned it. Later, Elvis made a crude remark to the guys about Natalie's feminine odor, and began exhibiting more tendencies toward voyeurism. A sexpot like Natalie naturally would have intimidated a man as sexually immature as Elvis, but there was another reason he had not had intercourse with her. Aside from his deep romance with June Juanico and his serious relationship with Barbara Hearn, he was also getting cozy with a female wrestler, Penny Banner. He had fallen hard for Deborah Paget, his physical ideal. "She's the most beautiful girl in the world," he told Photoplay magazine. Many accounts of his infatuation with Deborah hold that he couldn't get to first base with her, that she found him the moron she alluded to in print, and that his love was unrequited. But in truth, they both fell in love. Deborah, reserved and quiet, found him sweet, kind, and funny, and Elvis was entranced with more than just her perfect cheekbones and fragile beauty. She had two more qualities he admired. She was religious, from a Jewish background, and a virgin. Because Gladys told him to end up with a girl who was pure and untested, he always said he'd marry a virgin. Deborah remembered. But like Elvis, Deborah had a strong, unbreakable bond with her mother, Marguerite Gibson, who was also heavy-set and redoubtable like Gladys. The similarities were obvious to both Elvis and Deborah, and Elvis even saw a facial resemblance between Deborah and the youthful Gladys. To Elvis, who was looking for a virgin who embodied both his mother and his physical twin, Deborah became a prize beyond all imagining. He talked to Gladys about her all the time, going on, and she could see he was overwhelmed with her, calling her Debbie with a smile in his voice. When a reporter asked if he had a favorite female star, he said, "I love 'em all, but I've got one special gal, and she's the only gal for me. But she keeps me 64,000 miles away." And who was that? "Debbie," Elvis blurted. But there was a larger problem, aside from the fact that Elvis had already publicly declared that he had two girlfriends, Barbara Hearn and June Juanico. Deborah's brassy mother, who managed her daughter's career and had been in the theater, some said burlesque, inspiring Deborah's routine on The Milton Berle Show, wanted her to have nothing to do with him. Elvis couldn't figure it out. His conversations with Deborah, both on the set and at her house in Beverly Hills, where he sometimes played with a pet chimpanzee, he'd later get one himself, revolved largely around the topic of God. Yet her father, likewise, found Elvis not up to Deborah's standards. There were stories going around about him, the actress told Suzanne Finstad, and her mother, fearing the worst, would not let Deborah leave the house unchaperoned. Try as he might, Elvis could not convince Deborah's parents that he was not the hell-raising hooligan that some of the press made him out to be. As with so many of Elvis's younger love interests, Deborah had never been on an actual date, which made her even that more irresistible to him. But because of her parents' virulent reaction, Deborah dared not let Elvis know for certain that she returned his affections. "I was very shy then," she continued to Finstad. "I hardly talked. I'm not sure I ever told him how I felt, but he could feel it." Elvis could indeed feel it, but he didn't know what to think. Talk had it that Deborah was seeing Howard Hughes at the same time, and from the cars that came and went at Deborah's house, Elvis believed it was true. A week after the disastrous episode with Natalie Wood at the Beverly Wilshire, Nick Adams took Elvis out to a hotel in Malibu, where Natalie was enjoying a getaway with her bisexual boyfriend, actor Scott Marlowe. Natalie and Scott had spent the time talking, as they had before, about marrying. But both Warner Brothers, where Natalie was under contract, and her mother, Maria, strictly opposed the idea and forced them to break up. Now Elvis, Natalie, and Nick, also rumored to be bisexual, were almost a threesome, having a lot of fun together, Natalie told newspaper columnist Luella Parsons. They were seen that week at the Iris in Hollywood, watching the trashy B-movies Hot Rod Girls and Girls in Prison. Tab Hunter remembers how taken she was with him. "Natalie and I were in New York doing the Perry Como show, and we were walking back to her hotel. She was staying at the Essex House, and she was going on and on about Elvis, and I was getting a little annoyed and a little jealous here." The hotel sign spelled out ESSEXHOUSE all over Broadway, but the lights were out of the first two letters, making it read SEXHOUSE. I said, "Don't tell me he's going to come and visit you at the sex house." And she took her purse and went wham and just hauled off and belted me. Natalie was crazy about him. But deep down, Natalie also found Elvis desperately lonely, a lot like herself, even as so much about him mystified her. He acted more like a concerned older brother around her than anything else. And as she told Presley biographer Albert Goldman, he was a little too conventional, almost square. He was the first person of my age group I had ever met who said to me, "How come you're wearing makeup? Why do you want to go to New York? Why do you want to be on your own? Why don't you want to stay home and be a sweet little girl? It's nice to stay home." We'd go to P.C. Brown's and have a hot fudge sundae. We'd go to Hamburger Hamlet and have a burger and a Coke. He didn't drink. He didn't swear. He didn't even smoke. It was like having the date that I never ever had in high school. I thought it was really wild. Natalie's mother encouraged the relationship, even as Natalie herself was still dissatisfied with him in bed. Elvis didn't feel it was any big romance and continued to see as many women as he wanted. Around the same time, he and Nick spent a Sunday afternoon with Judy Spreckles, and later, the trio went horseback riding at Judy's ranch. Among her many pictures of Elvis is a photograph that freeze-frames the day. He was laughing. It was just such a fun time. She and Elvis loved each other all right, but it was just a really terrific friendship. Still, no matter what Elvis was doing with anyone else, Natalie was thinking about him. As proof, she had her seamstress make 2 big blousy velvet shirts for him, one in romance red and another in heartbreak blue. The shirts would become iconic as the ones Elvis wore on September 26, 1956, at his homecoming appearances at the Mississippi-Alabama Fair and Dairy Show, the blue for the afternoon performance and the red for the evening. However, the blue one almost didn't make it to Tupelo. Barbara Hearn was Elvis's date, and early that morning on Audubon Drive, where the Presleys were having remodeling work done, Elvis handed me something on a clothes hanger with a laundry cover on it. He said, "Hold this." There was a bit of confusion and lots of people around, and I stood there holding it until I thought, gosh, I'm not a closet rod here, and I laid it on the sofa. They rode down together in Elvis's new white Lincoln Mark II, and when they arrived at the dressing tent, Elvis suddenly turned to Barbara. "Where's my shirt? Do you have my shirt?" "What shirt?" "The shirt I gave you to hold this morning." Oh gosh, she didn't know he meant to bring that shirt. Barbara felt really bad, but Elvis was very sweet about it. They just quickly called somebody in Memphis who hadn't left yet, and they brought it on down. Elvis came to Tupelo at the invitation of James Savory, the Fair Association president. It was a day right out of Horatio Alger, a button-busting, local boy makes good story, with a jubilant parade. The city feared a riot, so Elvis wasn't actually in it. A banner across Main Street, "Tupelo welcomes Elvis Presley home," and the Rex Plaza, the nicest restaurant in town, serving up "Love Me Tender" steak and Ready Teddy pork chops. Governor J.P. Coleman read accolades from a scroll, calling Elvis America's #1 entertainer, and Mayor James Ballard even presented him with a guitar-shaped key to the city. Elvis returned the favor and then some. He signed his $10,000 check back over to Tupelo. "The last time I was here," he mentioned, "I didn't have a nickel to get in." Some 50,000 folks came to town for the festivities, the biggest turnout anyone could remember since Franklin Roosevelt visited during the Depression. 20,000 attended the evening show, 12,000 more than the entire population of Tupelo. 14-year-old Virginia Wynette Pugh, later to gain fame in country music as Tammy Wynette, was in the front row for the afternoon performance. At one point in the matinee, it all became too much for 16-year-old Judy Hopper, who'd traveled from Alamo, Tennessee, and jumped the 5-foot stage. "What did I want? I wanted Elvis." Later, she got to go back and hug and kiss him. She giggled until she almost hyperventilated, and the two had their picture made together. She already had some leaves out of his yard, and now she had his autograph, too. "It was a thrill, it really was," she gushed to the press in a drawl as wide as the Mississippi. "I'd like to go to Hollywood now." The Tupelo Daily Journal captured the mayhem in full. "Elvis," the girls shrieked, tearing their hair and sobbing hysterically. "Please, Elvis." Local police, county sheriffs, highway patrolmen, and even the National Guard stood ready in case there was trouble. But there wasn't any, not really, which was surprising, given the size of the crowd, the intensity of their love for Elvis, and the heat. Though it was late fall, the temperature had risen to such a ghastly degree that Barbara and Gladys melted in their folding chairs, Gladys sweltering in a brocade dress and stockings, a locket with a picture of Elvis around her neck. "It made me feel bad," she later told a friend, "to go back there like that and remember how poor we was." But clearly the Presley family, nearly run out of town in the late 1940s, had returned in triumph. 11 years earlier, Elvis had lost the talent contest with Old Shep on practically this very spot. And now his first motion picture was due out in November, and his double-sided single, Don't Be Cruel and Hound Dog, was number 1 and 2 on the charts. "I've been looking forward to this homecoming very much," he said in a press conference before the afternoon show. "I've been escorted out of these fairgrounds when I was a kid and snuck over the fence, but this is the first time I've been escorted in." A voice called out, "How about Natalie?" "I worry about her when I'm not there where she is," he said casually. "I don't think about her when I'm not." The newspaper reported that Mrs. Presley appeared a little bewildered by all the commotion, but smiled pleasantly for photographers. For Gladys, Elvis Presley Day was the validation that her son was just as special as she always knew he'd be. And for Vernon, the ex-con forced to leave town to find work, the moment was sweet revenge. He was standing outside the big tent in back of the stage when he saw Ernest Bowen, his old boss at L.P. McCarty & Sons, the wholesale grocer. Vernon had a delivery route when he worked for Bowen, and it was his last job before leaving Tupelo. Now Bowen was general manager of the radio station WELO and trying in vain to get into the tent to see about an interview for his announcer, Jack Crystal. "All of a sudden, this guy hollers at me. I didn't even recognize him, but it was Vernon, all cleaned up and greeting me like a long-lost friend," Bowen remembered. "He wanted to know if he could do anything, and I said, 'Yeah, get me in the tent.' He said, 'Just follow me,' and he just parted the waves. I asked Vernon, 'How are y'all doing?' He said, 'Oh, we're doing just great,' said, 'The boy is really taking care of us.'" When another radio announcer, Charlie Watts of the small station WTUP, approached the Presleys before the afternoon show, an exuberant Vernon, blond and handsome in a dark suit, white shirt, and tie, grabbed the microphone and hardly let it go, saying how proud he was and how much the family appreciated all the good people who've knocked themselves out being so nice to us. As 17-year-old engineer Ron Brandon ran the tape recorder and dutifully captured it all, Vernon went on to thank the police department and the highway patrol, and he got on such a roll that Watts finally just talked over him. But for once Vernon had overshadowed his wife, who barely had room to answer the man's questions about her favorite Elvis record. "Baby Play House," she announced cheerfully, picking the sexiest of all Elvis's songs, though mangling the title. "That's a good one," Vernon said, but Gladys kept going. "And Don't Be Cruel. That's my 2 favorites." Watts also took time to talk to Nick Adams, who had flown to Memphis with Elvis and Gene Smith after the completion of Love Me Tender and would stay for a week. Watts didn't really know who he was. "And you're a star, I understand. A motion picture star, right?" But Nick was self-effacing and respectful, demurring to talk about his own career, and calling Elvis the nicest person I've ever met in show business. I can't speak too highly about him. Then he bragged on Gladys's fried chicken and started to mention her okra, but he couldn't remember what it was. "Elvis," he yelled across the way, "what's the name of those things your mother fixed me up? Ochre?" Nick said he had come to Tupelo to support his friend, but he needed some propping up of his own. After a promising start in films, he could barely find work, and he'd spent the funds from his early successes, including Mr. Roberts and Rebel Without a Cause, on houses for himself and his parents. Naturally, in Memphis, he stayed with the Presleys. He was just about broke, Barbara understood, and he came in the house, and honest to goodness, his shoes were falling apart. They were horrible looking. Mrs. Presley looked at them and said, "Son, I don't want you coming in my house with those shoes. You're going to have to take them off and leave them outside." Then she told Elvis to take him out and buy him some new ones. Nick was in the car on the ride home from Tupelo, sitting in the back seat with Barbara in the front between Elvis and Red West. Elvis was driving faster than he should have been, Barbara thought, when suddenly the hood on the big white Lincoln flew up and totally obscured his vision. Someone had lifted it out of curiosity while the unattended car was in the parking lot. Automobiles of that quality were rare in Tupelo, and they hadn't closed it properly. The road was single lane, as I remember, with a narrow shoulder. Elvis managed to ease the car to the right and pull over, but what impressed me was that both Elvis and Red, ignoring their own safety, threw their arms around me as if to prevent me from hitting the windshield. When the car came to a stop, son of a bitch, damn, what was that? The boys again turned to Barbara. Are you all right? They asked. It wasn't a general, is anybody hurt, but a sweet and gentle concern just for me. Barbara visited Audubon Drive all of the time when Elvis was home, and he called her every night from California, both to say hello and to check up on her, the way he had called Dixie, even though he was cheating on her. I didn't mind him seeing movie stars like Natalie Wood and Deborah Paget, because I knew he was starstruck. He couldn't believe he was actually in the same world with them, and probably in his mind he was in love with everyone he met. But she had to think that in some ways she just didn't fit in with the whole group. She didn't have musical talent like Red, and while most of the boys cut up all the time, she and Elvis talked about more serious things. She could tell that Hollywood was changing him some, though he insisted it never would. During the making of Love Me Tender, Elvis told her on the phone that he had run into Jerry Lewis. It was still a thrill for him to see another star, but Lewis had disappointed him. Elvis told Barbara the comedian was disgusting, the way he behaved with all of these people around him, his yes men doing everything for him and hanging on him. Sometimes Elvis seemed to be living in a movie, and there were times when he appeared to not be able to separate his own identity from that of the Hollywood crowd. On October 18th, for example, he pulled into the Gulf Station at 2nd and Gayoso and was quickly mobbed by fans. The attendant, Ed Hopper, asked him to leave, and Elvis challenged him, only to have Hopper pull a knife, shades of Rebel Without a Cause, and a third man join in the fray. Elvis, who stood 6 feet only with the help of lifts in his shoes, hauled off and punched the 6'3" Hopper, giving him a black eye. All 3 men were arrested for assault and battery and disorderly conduct. Barbara was inadvertently at the center of it, as Elvis was supposed to pick her up near her bus stop that afternoon. But he had noticed a gas smell coming through his air conditioning vents, which prompted the stop at the station. She was still standing waiting for him when a young woman approached her and asked if she were Barbara Hearn. Elvis had sent word about what had happened, and the woman told her that the police had taken him to jail. Barbara hardly knew what to say. About then, a policeman drove up to get her, and she was so shy she could barely climb in the back of the cruiser. But when they got downtown, Elvis was already gone, and the officer rode her on out to Audubon Drive. The ordeal had been nearly as hard on Barbara as it had on Elvis. I was mortified beyond words to be riding across town in a police car. If Elvis ever doubted my sincere regard for him, that should have clenched it. That night, a newspaper photographer came out and took a picture of Elvis at the organ. Barbara sat near him, holding Gladys's little dog, Sweet Pea. I looked so sad and bedraggled because I had been working hard all day while Elvis was showing off his temper downtown. The next day, the charges against Elvis would be dismissed, while the other 2 men would be fined. And there was other news. Later that afternoon, June Juanico would arrive from Biloxi for a visit. Barbara had learned of June from the newspaper. She'd picked up the Memphis Commercial Appeal one morning to find Elvis's remarks from the RCA press conference about the 2 girls he was seeing, along with a big, splashy story about the other women in his life. Once the shock wore off, Barbara took it in stride. It was really neat that he had named me, but that was the first I'd heard of June. The paper carried a picture of her own sweet self, of course, along with several rows of photos of Elvis's other dates. One was a stripteaser from Las Vegas, and another was a lady wrestler. My family said, "Well, that's just where you belong, isn't it, Barbara? Right up there with the stripteasers and the lady wrestlers." 11. Showgirls and Shavers. Just as Elvis had stayed in constant touch with Barbara through the filming of Love Me Tender, he had also heavily romanced June, sending her a lovesick telegram on August 21st, 1956. "Hi, Whittlebitty. I miss you, baby. Haven't had you out of my mind for a second. I'll always be yours and yours alone to love. Dreamed about you last night. Love ya. Yeah, E.P." As if for proof, June had barely arrived on Audubon Drive when Elvis wanted to take her to his room. They'd been in there together countless times, but this one was different. Elvis closed the door. I told him, no, June remembers. I got up and said, keep the door open. I'm not going to stay in here with the door shut. And so their relationship remained unconsummated. June's visit coordinated with Elvis's rehearsal for his second appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show at the end of October. For days, she sat on the floor, enthralled at being surrounded by Elvis and the Jordanaires, the vocal backing group he used in concert and on records. She and Elvis often harmonized in the car on such songs as Side by Side and the old hymn In the Garden. Now, in rehearsal with the Jordanaires on Love Me Tender, she felt free to jump right in. She'd hang on to Gordon Stoker's ringing tenor, and if Gordon stopped and she kept on, Elvis would just look at me and grin. Before leaving for New York, she and Elvis saw a rough cut of the movie with his parents. Elvis found it difficult to watch his performance, but then it was so hard to keep up with all the whirling emotions of fame. Variety, the show business trade paper, had just declared Elvis a millionaire in 1 year, based on the projections of his income from the movie contracts, records, song publishing, merchandising, and concerts. While June was still visiting, Elvis came home with a big old box of cash from the bank in 10s, 20s, and 100s. He sat on the floor and he said, June, would you like to see $1 million? And he threw it up in the air. Gladys and Vernon walked in, and Vernon held his head. Are you crazy, son? He said, and scrambled to pick it all up. June wondered for a minute if she should grab some, but she knew it wasn't the right thing to do. One reason Elvis liked her, she thought, was because she wouldn't take anything from him. The money had probably been a test, a suggestion from Parker, who often left people alone with large amounts of cash to see if he could trust them. June, who despised Parker and thought he schemed to keep her and Elvis apart, had been thinking a lot about him lately, wondering why the Colonel and Nick Adams seemed to be so chummy. Nick arrived for yet another visit on October 23rd, 4 days into her own stay in Memphis, and he planned to go with Elvis to New York for the Sullivan Show. He was constantly stuck up Elvis's butt, she fumed. In her heart of hearts, she believed that Nick was on the Colonel's payroll, that he kept an eye out for whatever went on and reported back to him. She also believed the Colonel promoted Elvis's relationship with Natalie Wood for publicity value. Still, June was stunned to learn that Natalie was coming to Memphis during Nick's extended stay. Elvis didn't invite Natalie, she says. Nick did, and the Colonel made all the arrangements. The actor Robert Vaughn, with whom Natalie had just become involved, thought she did it for spite, to make him jealous. Others believed she came because she cared for Elvis and still hoped to spark their romance. No matter why Natalie agreed to come to Memphis, it was uncomfortable for everyone, even before she got there. Nick kept asking Elvis when June was going to leave. There's not room for Natalie if June's going to be here, he said one day in her presence. It got her hackles up. I said, no, Nick, you've got that backward. There's not room for me. Elvis stepped in the middle. I don't care, he said. June's going to stay. Finally, June announced she was going home to Biloxi when Elvis left for New York. Nick seemed relieved, but June disliked him for another reason, too. Nick tried to put his hands on me. He came on to me. I said, you touch me one more time, you're in trouble. She never told Elvis about it because Elvis felt sorry for him. Nick came across as a basically decent kid, but I really think he was bad for Elvis. She suspected, in fact, that Nick introduced Elvis to prescription drugs, more specifically to speed. She knew that Elvis took no-dose pills, which contained caffeine, but that was all. Nick was always up, always wired. Before he got there, Elvis was easy and laid back. But when Nick got there, Elvis seemed to be wired too. And you can't get that wired from cola or coffee, and that's about all Elvis drank. Certainly Elvis did not seem himself during Natalie's visit. Or at least Philip Barber didn't think so. Philip was a freshman at Memphis State that fall. A native of Dixon, Tennessee, he had decided to go to school in Memphis partly out of his love for Elvis's music. He hoped to practice law in the music business, so enthralled was he with rhythm and blues and rock and roll. Philip often hung out at the Cotton Club in West Memphis, Arkansas, where he became entranced with Barbara Pittman, who sang with Clyde Leopard's Sneerly Ranch Boys, a former neighbor of the Presleys from the projects. Barbara was the only female recording artist on Sun Records. Like Elvis, she'd sung at the Eagle's Nest, and she'd been in love with him ever since they met, remembering how silly he'd been to put black shoe polish on his hair to look like Tony Curtis. Look, there is no blonde-headed idol except James Dean. One day, they'd performed together on Jackson Avenue at the Little Flower Catholic Church, and after the show, it started pouring down rain. Black shoe polish was coming out all over Elvis's face. He could almost do an Al Jolson. They were tight enough that Elvis had taken her Sun publicity picture, and sometimes, if Sam and Marion had to be out, Elvis and Barbara would go down in the afternoons after work and take care of the studio. A lot of people were talking to Elvis on the phone at that time, and never even knew it. Philip had been to see Barbara one night that fall, leaving a little after 1 a.m., and then driving over by Elvis's house on Audubon Drive. There was always something going on there when Elvis was in town, but on this night, he was surprised to see Elvis standing out front with a guy he eventually figured out was Nick Adams. It looked like a loose enough gathering, so Philip parked his car and walked over and stood on the edge of the guy contingency, where Elvis was talking to 5 teenage girls who worked at a Crystal hamburger stand. They were all hanging around the iron gate that closed off the driveway, the girls tittering and laughing and asking Elvis questions. It was easy for Philip to join in because they were very congenial to me. But then the talk turned, really rough considering the day and time. One of the girls said to Elvis, "We came by here Monday night. Were you here?" He said, "Yeah," and she said, "Well, what were you doing?" He said, "Oh, I was sitting in there watching you all drive by and jacking off." Philip was shocked that Elvis would use that kind of language. I came from a small rural town, and boy, you didn't ever say that, not even to men, much less in front of women. But he wrote it off to the fact that Elvis was now an urbane, sophisticated uptown man, an actor in the movies. Then one of the girls wanted to know about Natalie. "Is she here now?" she asked. "Yeah," Elvis said. "She's in the house asleep." "We read about you going together," she purred. Nah," Elvis told her. "She's just a kid." By now, the crowd had grown larger, but it was still made up mostly of females and married couples. Then, about 2:30 a.m., Philip noticed a car pull up. This girl got out and squealed and ran over and grabbed Elvis and just kissed him a big wet kiss. Philip recognized her immediately. She was Barbara Pittman, the singer he'd just been to see. She just glued herself to him, and then he was pretty much occupied with her for the rest of the night. Later, Barbara would tell Philip that Elvis called her his little vibrator, because when she got around him, I'd just get so giddy and wiggly. When Philip got ready to leave that night, Elvis said, "Come back tomorrow. We'll be out here." The next afternoon, when Philip returned, Natalie was in the yard, inside the low fence, signing autographs. Elvis introduced them, and she shook Philip's hand and smiled, and went on back to signing. But Natalie didn't like such familiarity with fans, and was astonished that Elvis permitted them to be so intrusive, even letting them look in the windows. She hadn't known anybody like him, and he mystified her sometimes. They were just so different. "I hadn't been around anyone who was religious," she said later. "He felt he had been given this gift, this talent, by God. He didn't take it for granted. He thought it was something that he had to protect. He had to be nice to people, otherwise God would take it all away." On the whole, her visit hadn't gone well. Elvis tooled the petite star around town in the white Lincoln, stopping for ice cream at the fairgrounds. But he didn't really know what to do with her, so he drove her down to Tupelo to show her where he started out, took her over to meet Dewey Phillips, and rode her around on his huge new Harley-Davidson motorcycle. But nobody seemed to be having a good time. Not really. She watched him play touch football in Guthrie Park, where Nick tentatively joined in, but she was bored. The most exciting part was the inventive way Elvis escaped the fans who'd gathered by game's end. He casually drew a comb from his pocket, waved it through his hair, and then nonchalantly threw it out on the field. When the girls sprang to get it, he and Natalie dashed off the other way for the Harley, speeding off on Chelsea Avenue. Once during Natalie's visit, he stopped by to see Barbara Hearn. They talked and visited a little while, and then Barbara's aunt went to the window. "Elvis," she said, "who's that out there on your motorcycle?" "Well, that's Natalie Wood." He'd just left her out there in front waiting for him, as Barbara tells it. My aunt said, "Why didn't you tell her to come inside?" And he said, "No, I'm leaving," and off he went. By then, he wasn't as much in tune with people's feelings. He was a caring, feeling person by nature, but I think that was being taken away from him. He was losing it. Gladys was also losing it, but in a different way. "Man, Gladys was stoned till Sunday morning," said Barbara Pittman. "She couldn't even get up to go to church. I shouldn't say that about Gladys. I loved her very much. But Vernon was a pretty heavy drinker, too. He just enjoyed having all that free booze and free life because he never worked anyway. He always had a bad back." Natalie's visit exacerbated everything with Gladys, and it was obvious even to people who didn't know her well. When Wink Martindale and his TV co-host, Susie Bancroft, went out to the house during Nick and Natalie's visit, we just sang and stood around a lot. I remember his mother being there and seeming so out of place. It just made Gladys wild. She complained to her sister Lillian that Natalie was too fond of the men, didn't even finish her meal when Nick Adams and the boys came over. She was so upset that she vented to Barbara, too. She didn't like provocative women, and she called me and said Natalie was walking around the house in a flimsy nightgown in front of the men who were working on the house. She thought that was thoroughly bad behavior and said she would be glad when Natalie left. Natalie felt the same way. 3 days into what was supposed to be a week-long stay, she aborted her visit, flying back to L.A. in tight toreador pants with Nick at her side. Robert Vaughn met her at the airport, and photographers snapped pictures of Elvis's new girlfriend. Her William Morris agent, Michael Zimring, said, "She looked like a rat that had died. I don't think she'd been to sleep for a week." In her book, Natalie, a memoir by her sister, Lana Wood, recounts that the family helped Natalie cook up the sudden departure. She'd called home moaning that Elvis's mother was domineering and jealous. "Gladys has wrecked everything," Natalie said. "I don't have a chance. Get me out of this and fast." It was agreed that Maria would call Natalie back and ask her to come home because of an emergency. The romance was over. "God, it was awful," Natalie told Lana later. "He can sing, but he can't do much else." After that, whenever Natalie's name came up, Elvis laughed. "Heaven help us," he said. "That girl is crazy." However, Elvis would have no shortage of entertaining friends, as 2 days after Natalie's departure, he asked Cliff Cleaves to move into the house as a gopher to make things easier for himself and his parents. Gladys accepted him, but wished her son would be more selective of his companions. A ne'er-do-well, Cleaves was a flunky DJ from Jackson, Tennessee, and a pal of Dewey Phillips. He looked as if he slept in his clothes, but he had an offbeat and riotous sense of humor, and he wasn't beyond trying any sort of con. Jipping restaurateurs out of a huge steak dinner, for example, which amused Elvis to no end. In the future, Elvis would suspend him from the group for outrageous grifting and unspeakable hooliganisms, only to take him back. But for now, he had his place. Through Cliff, Elvis became reacquainted with Lamar Fike, a 300-pound Memphian who'd tried to break into radio through George Klein. Fike, who lived at the YMCA, was comical-looking. He'd soon start wearing yellow cowboy boots. But he had a first-rate mind, and in time Elvis would invite him into the entourage. For now, Elvis was still traveling with his cousin Gene Smith, though Bitsy Mott, the colonel's brother-in-law and a former professional baseball player, had joined him as head of security. On November 8, 1956, the three of them boarded a train for Las Vegas. Elvis needed to shake off all the voodoo from Nick and Natalie, as well as his jitters about Love Me Tender, which would open in New York on November 15th. He stayed at the New Frontier, where he had played earlier in the year, and immediately began seeing 19-year-old Marilyn Evans, a showgirl at the hotel. He'd walked into the employees-only coffee shop at the casino and sat at her table. Wow, she thought, he's beautiful, really, truly. Within an hour, he had slipped her a scrawled note on the back of a napkin. Can I have a date with you tomorrow night or before I leave? Elvis told Marilyn he likes her because she doesn't act like a showgirl, because he's real, her mother bragged to her hometown paper, the Fresno Bee, at the time. He invited Marilyn to come visit him in Memphis the following month. But then he met Dottie Harmony, a blonde 18-year-old dancer at the Thunderbird who had a friend who worked at the New Frontier. Elvis kept trying to get her attention, sending requests to her table for her to join him, but she ignored him. Then all of a sudden she looked over, and there was Elvis on his knees saying, "Ma'am, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my life. Would you have a drink with me?" From then on, he spent the rest of his vacation with her. They talked a lot. He made her call her mother, like he did every night. But mainly, they just hung out, driving to the airport and watching the planes take off, going to the Vegas shows, even helping an old man change a tire one night. She was a little frightened at how jealous Scott got when other men looked her up and down, and when they fought, he'd get so angry he'd rip the phone out of the wall. But next thing I knew, it was always fixed again. Even though it was Dottie he liked, on December 4th, Elvis made good on his promise to bring Marilyn Evans to Audubon Drive, where that phone just rang and nobody answered, which was odd. Elvis made no moves on her. He was extremely honorable, and treated her to the usual motorcycle rides and eating out. But they quickly realized there was nothing between them. I always preferred classical music for starters. We were just into different things, not that one is better than the other. Evans would have been a totally forgettable presence in Elvis's life, except for one stop they made during her visit. It was at the Sun Studio, where Carl Perkins was recording, with Jerry Lee Lewis playing piano on the session. Johnny Cash also dropped by, and Sam Phillips called the newspaper, which sent over a photographer as the tape rolled. The recordings would become famous as the $1 Million Quartet session, though Cash doesn't really sing. And though Marilyn is often cropped out of the iconic photograph, in the full shot, she's clearly on the right, seated atop the piano. Her voice can be heard on the recordings, requesting a song, End of the Road. Hearing it now, she says, is otherworldly, out of body. Just over a week later, Elvis had another guest, Hollywood director Hal Cantor, who was set to helm Elvis's next picture, Loving You, his first for Paramount and Hal Wallace. Cantor, writing with Herbert Baker, would loosely base his screenplay on Elvis's own story. A truck driver with a knack for a song catches the eye of a manipulative press agent who propels him to fame. Cantor, a Southerner himself, born in Savannah, Georgia, had come to the project after running into Wallace, who said, as the director remembers, "I want you to come see a test of a young man. I want you to see if you can do a picture with him." "What's his name?" "Elvis Presley." "He must be kidding. Just look at the test, will you?" Cantor agreed, but surely in vain. Foolishly, I subscribed to the generation that said, "He's just a passing fancy, a nasty little boy." But he walked out of the screening room with a different attitude. He thought Elvis was dynamite. Wallace had a first draft screenplay, Lonesome Cowboy, which Cantor completely rewrote with the title Stranger in Town. Then the director went to Memphis to meet Elvis. There, he sampled Gladys's Chicken and Okra on Audubon Drive, a modest home, decorated in a style that displayed more financial success than taste. He would write in his autobiography, "So far, so funny, my life in show business." He didn't like the meal very much either. Afterward, Elvis had a question for him. Was his character, Deke Rivers, required to smile much in the movie? "What do you mean, do you have to smile?" "Well, I've been watching a lot of movies. People like Jimmy Dean and Humphrey Bogart and Marlon Brando. Good actors. They hardly ever smile. And the women love 'em because they don't smile." Elvis brought the director up short. That had never occurred to him, but Elvis was right. He said, "When I smile, I want it to be an event." And I said, "Very well put." Then Elvis told him he didn't think he was much of an actor, but he was working on being true to the words. "I figure if I make people believe the words, that's all that counts." Cantor again told Elvis he was astute. And then Gene Smith goaded Elvis into doing what he called the piece. Elvis said, No, I don't want to." Go ahead, Elvis, do the piece for the man, do the piece." Elvis stood up, and Cantor expected him to start, "The boy stood on the burning deck." Instead, he was amazed as Elvis recited Douglas MacArthur's farewell address to Congress. I'm not a fan of Douglas MacArthur, but it was pretty good. The next evening, they all left Memphis in a 2-car caravan, Cantor riding with Elvis to Shreveport to witness his last appearance on the Louisiana Hayride on December 15th. This was the benefit show that Parker had promised as part of Elvis's contract buyout. The Shreveport YMCA would get a new swimming pool out of the deal, and attendance was expected to be so large that the organizers moved it to the largest facility in town, the Hirsch Coliseum, also known as the Youth Center, at the Louisiana Fairgrounds. Every ticket had been sold. I observed that concert, and things I saw there I later used on screen. I recreated some of it. There were some things that happened there that I couldn't recreate because people wouldn't believe it. It was absolutely unbelievable, the things that I saw. It was true. Horace Logan had the roof of his 1955 Mercury hardtop stomped in by teenage girls. He'd parked it in the back of the Coliseum, in a place that seemed perfectly safe, but the kids had stood on it, dancing to the music, or used it as a trampoline to try to see through the Coliseum's 12-foot windows. It looked like an elephant had danced a jig on it, Logan lamented. The top was pushed in so far it was practically touching the backs of the seats. Then there was the child who swallowed her hand, or at least Cantor thought she had. She appeared to have her hand in her mouth all the way down to her wrist, and I was wondering, how can a little girl like this get her whole hand down her throat? And then at one point she pulled her hand out of her mouth, and I found out she didn't have a hand at all. She was just sucking on the stump. I thought, God, I've got to get that in the picture. At first, however, Cantor wondered if he would even survive the trip to Shreveport. He sat next to Elvis while Gene, Jr., and Bitsy occupied the back seat. They raced through the chilly night, Elvis singing and cracking jokes until he stopped for refreshments, a piss, a pop, and some barbecued pork, as Cantor detailed in his book. The restaurant, of course, was the Trio Club, the Brown family's roadhouse in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Maxine caught Elvis and Bonnie pining for each other, not saying a word, but kind of smiling and looking sad at the same time. Both of them knew that life was about to change forever, as Maxine put it. He wasn't that big of a star yet, but the Elvis Presley who left our club that night was not the same as the one the world grew to adore. Back out on the road, Cantor wrote, a souped-up Chevy pulled up beside us. 4 men and 3 women were packed into the hot rod, and one of the girls yelled, "Hey, Elvis!" Elvis slowed his Cadillac and lowered his window to call, "Howdy, honey," and Bitsy Mott warned, "This ain't no time to stop for Pussy Boy." The ersatz cowboy driving the Chevy shouted, "Drag you for a tank of gas, Presley." Is he kidding? Elvis grinned, stomped on his accelerator, and we zoomed from 40 to 90 miles per hour. Elvis loved that. I was terrified, and he loved that too. They arrived at the Captain Shreve Hotel about 5 in the morning, and too soon, Cantor was awakened by shouts of "Elvis, Elvis" coming from the street below. In just a few hours, he would ride to the Louisiana Fairgrounds with the young star to check the equipment for the evening. Bill Black drove the Cadillac, and Cantor sat in the back. When the car came to a stop, the crowd surrounded the caddy and started rocking it. Cantor was scared stiff, but Bill just laughed. Shit, this happens wherever we go. In town to see the performance was Kay Wheeler, Elvis's fan club president. Several months before, she'd organized a ride-in campaign to bring Elvis to Dallas, Texas. It was so successful, 26,500 kids showed up, that we had to get the huge Cotton Bowl, the largest venue for an Elvis show. She was the only teenager and the only woman allowed on the field. The next day, she went to Waco to see Elvis's show at the Hardo, Texas Coliseum and got in trouble with Colonel Parker for telling the Associated Press that Waco was the squarest town in America, since the sparse crowd sat on their hands and nobody screamed. And in November, she'd traveled to Memphis, where she visited with Barbara Hearn at her house, the two of them lying on the floor and leafing through scrapbooks, to Kay's delight. She also spent a day with Gladys, who told Kay she reminded her of herself as a young girl. "You favor me a little, don't you, hun?" Kay thought Gladys seemed sad, but she didn't dwell on it long because she was too excited. Elvis had Kay's framed picture by his bed, and Gladys had even offered to give her Elvis's white buck shoes, but Kay turned them down. I didn't want his old stinky shoes in my suitcase. She wanted the Kelly green sport coat he had on in Dallas. "You'll probably have it before the night is over," he promised her suggestively, but that hadn't happened, and then Gladys couldn't find it. Now, in Shreveport, where she was setting up a new branch of the fan club, Kay attended Elvis's hour-long press conference at the youth center. I wanted to impress him. I knew I had the jet-black hair and good behind that Elvis liked. So she wore her tight white sheath dress with silver sparkles and white fur at the cuffs. Even though she stood in the back, Elvis, modeling the famous green coat, spotted Kay right off and stared at her hungrily as she answered a question about the fan club. A few minutes later, Cliff Gleaves approached her. "Elvis wants you to come back to the hotel." At the Captain Shreve, Cliff escorted her to what was obviously Elvis's bedroom. "Wait here," he said, and then shut the door. She stared at the bed for a while, but after 15 minutes, when Elvis still wasn't there, she lost her nerve. I thought, I can't go through with this. I'm not this kind of girl. I'm a virgin. This is like something in a bad movie. She got up and walked out into the hall, where Elvis's guys were hanging out in front of another room. Kay stuck her head in to see Elvis on the phone. There was a flurry of activity. Someone was taking orders for sandwiches, and everybody was high on something or another, maybe just the excitement of the concert. But Elvis, unbuttoning his shirt sleeves, beckoned her in. Come here, come here, come here." She was the only woman in the room, so she walked over and picked up his green coat and put it on, almost for protection. It was all sweaty, but she liked feeling him against her skin, even though the coat was so big that it dwarfed her. Elvis grinned at the sight of her in it. "You look good in that," he said. "Do you want a sandwich?" "No, thanks." "Okay," he said, looking around the room. "Are we going to order?" Somebody spoke up. "Elvis, what do you want on your sandwich?" "Mustard, mayonnaise, pickles, and cat shit," he said, laughing at his own joke. All the guys laughed in unison, but the bad language turned Kay off. And as the time wore on and Elvis kept fooling around, she became more disenchanted. Finally, she just eased out the door. That got his attention, and he chased her down the hall and into the stairwell. She was a little disgusted with him and with herself, and now they paused by the window at the end of the stairwell and looked down at the street. I thought, well, I have him right here, just me and him. But she wanted to say something profound, because she didn't want to be just another of the girls. "Elvis," she said quietly, "what do you think life is all about, really?" He was standing behind her, very close, his breath warm on the back of her neck. Now he turned her around, and she thought he was going to make a stab at answering her question, or maybe kiss her in that soft, romantic way, but Elvis was not in the mood for subtlety. To Kay's astonishment, he got really rough with me. He grabbed me and kissed me so long and hard I thought I was going to suffocate. He wouldn't get off my lips. Then he threw me against the wall and started grinding his pelvis, pushing on me really heavy. It was exactly what he did on stage, his whole performance. Except that Elvis was genuinely aroused and meant business, keeping Kay in such a hold she couldn't move. She wasn't just turned off now, she was frightened. It was too raw for a 17-year-old virgin. I was not old enough for what he had in mind, and it really disappointed me because I wanted moonlight and roses. It was one of the biggest letdowns of my life. She didn't push him away, though, and soon someone started screaming, "Where's Elvis? Where's Elvis?" Whenever Elvis's guys got separated from him, she thought, it was like they lost their dancing bear or something. They all went nuts. But the emergency was only that the sandwiches had arrived, and Elvis coaxed Kay back to the room. She stayed for a few minutes, but her stomach hurt, and her head was swimming, and then she just slipped out and went downstairs and got a cab. I felt a little bit powerful as I walked out of that hotel. I'd passed some girls, floozy little things, in the hall, and I presumed they'd been set up like I was. I thought, I'm not one of you. He'll remember me for not doing it, because they were flinging their bodies at him en masse. It was just crazy, a mob scene. It had been even wilder at the show, Frank Page remembering they'd tried to protect Elvis by erecting a fence in front of the stage and setting the chairs back 40 feet. But the girls, nearly 10,000 of them, picked up the chairs and ran to the edge of the stage, so they defeated our purpose of trying to keep them back. Afterward, to get him out of the Coliseum unharmed, the colonel sent a decoy out one door while Elvis escaped through another, the swarm following the wrong boy. Page, thoroughly shaken, had never witnessed pandemonium like that and hoped he wouldn't again. 10,000 girls screaming at the tops of their lungs made noise enough to peel paint, as Horace Logan put it. Nobody could tell if Elvis was really singing or not, or even if the band was playing, but nobody seemed to care. The waves of screams washed through the Coliseum like an angry ocean. At the end, Hoss Logan, standing there in his sheriff's gear, a pair of real 6-guns in his big Western holster, would utter the now-famous phrase, "Elvis has left the building." Barbara Hearn would sometimes stand inside the Audubon Drive house, looking out the window at all the fans. I'd wonder, why am I on this side of the glass? It was a bit daunting at times, and it was becoming more so, and not just because of the fame. Sometimes she thought she didn't really know Elvis. He'd called her one night saying he'd been over to one of the West Memphis clubs to listen to music, and somehow met some boy she'd dated in high school. She hadn't seen the guy since graduation day, but Elvis went off about what all he was going to do to him if he ever saw him again. He treated Barbara like she'd committed a crime for ever having known the kid. Where did he get off thinking like that, when he had so many girlfriends that the newspaper ran rows of pictures? She tried not to think about it, though, because Christmas was almost on them, and she wanted them to have a nice holiday. No, an extra nice holiday. And she wanted her gifts to be special, too, even though she didn't have much money. One day they were out riding on his motorcycle, and he pulled into a used car lot and bought her a yellow Buick convertible to get back and forth to Memphis State. She didn't have the nerve to tell him, but it broke down all the time. I never knew whether I was going to get where I was going, and it just nickel and dimed her to death. She thought a gold lame vest would be an appropriate Christmas gift, and she knew that he could wear it on stage. So she went down to the seconds department at Goldsmith's, where they sold remnants of material, and she bought the gold lame and 3 gold initials and some black taffeta for the lining, and asked her girlfriend's mother to make it for her. She wasn't sure what to get Gladys and Vernon, but she finally settled on a large, ornate gold Bible with color illustrations. It was out of her price range, really, but she'd splurged because Elvis had had such a remarkable year, and it was truly a Christmas to celebrate. June Juanico had been thinking about Christmas, too, though she hadn't actually seen Elvis since her strained visit in October. It was getting late in the year now, and neither of them had said anything about whether they would spend the holiday in Memphis or Biloxi. But surely he would call about it any day now, because they were practically engaged, even though she'd never accepted that ring he'd tried to give her. The only thing that worried her was that he was so jealous of all of her friends, wanting to keep me right next to him with his arm around me and show people that I belonged to him, and all this kind of crap. It had a smothering effect. But on Christmas Day, neither Barbara nor June sat at Gladys's holiday table. For the most glorious day of his most magnificent year, Elvis chose Dottie Harmony to be at his side. He hadn't even known her 2 months. When June found out she hit the ceiling, Elvis tried to calm her. "It was the Colonel's idea, baby, honest, for the publicity. He said it was good for my career." She knew that Parker did want him linked with actresses and dancers, and Elvis did like legs that went on for days. "But you don't invite a showgirl to spend Christmas at your house." That was it for her. If he cared for me, how could he expect me to swallow all these other women in his life? I was going to be his one and only, or I wasn't going to be anything. And now Elvis was saying he couldn't get married, not even after 3 years. He wouldn't dare do that to the Colonel. He had too much invested in him. June felt something break inside of her. And now Barbara would too. She just kept saying it over and over. Dottie Harmony, a chorus girl, and for Christmas. That was a time for family and special friends, not a newly acquired Las Vegas showgirl. If it had been Elizabeth Taylor or somebody, I wouldn't have minded, but this really hurt me. And there was more hurt around the bend. When Barbara gave Elvis his gold lame vest, he handed her an unexpected gift, a sunbeam shaver. Her heart landed with such a thud that for a moment it knocked the breath out of her. She had gone to so much trouble with the vest, and she'd had to put his parents' gift in layaway, since she didn't have the money to buy it all at once. It was a pretty shaver, with rhinestones on the little stand and a quilted cover, but it was still a shaver, and certainly not the kind of thing he would have ordinarily gotten for me. It felt like he realized a day or two before Christmas, oh my goodness, I haven't gotten anything for Barbara, and threw a few dollars at someone who went out and got it. I didn't need it or want it, and I never used it. I truly believe I had rather gotten nothing than that shaver. I still have the miserable thing, but it was an embarrassment then, and is still. Elvis couldn't win for losing. All his women were either mad at him or breaking off their relationship. Nothing seemed to work, just nothing. That Christmas, he was driving around, thinking about things, when he spotted Georgia Avgaris, the Greek girl he'd thrown gum wrappers at in high school. She was window shopping, and he pulled the big Cadillac up next to the curb and got out to greet her. He was so glad to see her, and no, he hadn't heard she'd gotten married last year. But wow, she looked great, and he hoped she was happy. He'd made a few records since he last saw her. Would she like to have some? He had them in the car. "Gee, Elvis," she said. "Thanks, but no thanks. I don't have a record player."